Yeah, my name is Ulrich Mors, but I think the last time somebody called me Ulrich was my father when he was angry on me. So actually everybody calls me Uli, and that's fine. Yeah, let's meet today for the FX6. We called it special training. Because Vocas came to me and said, there are a lot of FX6 users that are not too familiar with the FX6, and there are some other people who already shot with the FX6 and don't know the details, and if you could do a special training on that. So I think you all are experienced enough to see what connections the camera has and what recording cards come inside, so we don't cover this at all. We even don't cover the sensor itself. It's just a full frame sensor like in the alpha cameras, and you can use it in different crop modes. So I think this is generally known, but I think we can do some more special things today, even because we only have 4 hours roughly, because when I do camera trainings with, let's say, 10 people, then usually everybody brings a camera, and then we do 2 days inclusive S-Log workshop and S-Log grading, and go very deep into the camera, and I try to pick up some of these topics and present it today. I think with roughly 15, 16, 17 people, it's still possible to make a very short introduction of yourself. Because it's a good idea that I know what you are doing, if you're already shooting with FX6 or not, or if you have dedicated questions or ideas for today. Because I have an agenda, but I'm not sure if this is the right agenda for everybody. So I would start on the left side. Could you just introduce yourself? Short question.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, I see. So from unboxed camera, fresh unboxed camera, up to very experienced people, that's always the big problem for me. So because if it's, you know, if you're very unexperienced, it's easy to start with the camera because you can show the main features of the camera and go to some special features. And now I'm torn between going to the very special features, but to the general features as well. So I'll do a little agenda. If you have certain questions, as Andre said, there's a paper in front. If you have very specific questions, just write them down there. I will have a look on them in the break. Perhaps, for example, we have 2 or 3 people that want to compare FX9 against FX6, and I guess you're just a small group. So I would put this to the end in a more personal thing. So, like after the event that we may meet and discuss FX9 against FX6, I can tell some general things, but there are very specific details that probably are not everybody's interested in. So I would focus on the FX6 and the FX3 perhaps in comparison in the main event, and then we can talk about FX9 and FX6 as well. Perhaps so far in Germany, where I come from, the R&D group like WDR, Bayerischer Rundfunk, etc., especially Cologne and Berlin, are very focused on the FX9 because the FX9 was there earlier. So the FS7 came out 2014. I know this exactly because when I started writing the book, it took roughly 1 year. So the FS7 was end of 2014, existing for years. And when the FX9 came out some years ago, 2 years ago roughly, everybody in Germany said, oh, autofocus, full frame, yeah, let's get rid of the FS7, let's buy an FX9. And the FX9 can also have a Super 35 readout like the FS7, so it's replacing the FS7. And roughly 1 year later, the FX6 came out, and a lot of people said, oh, it can do more, it's cheaper, it's lightweight, you can put it on a gimbal. Not every gimbal, of course, but a stronger gimbal, like RS2 or RS3 now from DJI. So a lot of people say, oh, it can do more, and perhaps it's the better camera. But in comparison, FX9 can do things that the FX6 cannot do, and the FX6 can do things that the FX9 cannot do. So actually, we have to discuss, and everybody's invited to join us when we're talking about FX9 and FX6 later. Just to, a little bit to my experience, I'm coming from the sound side, as a sound engineer in the 90s, in a recording studio, doing rock music, punk music, everything. And I came into video editing roughly 2006, and I met the Sony people at this time, and they asked me if I could join a roadshow. with the PDW 700 cameras, so shoulder cameras. And I made some good presentations, obviously, so the broadcasters came to me and asked, could you do camera trainings to our people? And this is when I started, roughly 2008, giving camera courses to camera people. And suddenly I went from audio to video, and yeah, it's a good idea if you still know how to hold a microphone, or how to speak into the microphone, and surprise people with headphones. Since 2 years, I'm also lecturer in 2 universities, part-time lecturer for post-production, especially editing and grading. And if you say grading, usually you talk about Resolve. So I'm a Resolve trainer. I was in Manchester and did some courses there, and yeah, and there's a lot of connection between grading and the FX6, because just a very rough example. Instead of having some models here, I have some posters with me. They don't run away, they don't eat, they don't get any money for it, and you can see them there. And one of the most important things of FX9, FX6, and FX3 is the so-called asynchronous. Asynchronous is an artificial word, because it says nothing else than film look. But Sony didn't want to use the word film look, so they took film, cine, and look, tone, and S is Sony. So Sony film look, asynchronous, and it's coming from the Venice. This is the Venice 2, but the very first Venice was absolutely new. There was a new color system in the camera, a new color approach. And Sony introduced asynchronous as a look straight off the camera with the Venice. And then they came out with the smaller cameras, and they put the same strategy, let's say the same film look, into the small cameras as well. And so we have to talk about asynchronous later a little bit. It's much more forgiving regarding highlights. It's much smoother skin tones. It has a smoother look. It's not as contrasty as Rec 709, and this is something people wished in the last years. So if you see to Canon, Blackmagic, Red, there was always a dedicated film look, and Sony took quite a long time to adapt to it. Sony was very standardized, very Rec 709, very TV show stylish. If you want to make a TV show, a live show, like a quiz show or something like that, or Jeopardy, it's a good idea to switch it off and go to Rec 709, because Rec 709 is more contrasty, more saturated colors, more pop colors. So don't try to reach these aims with this film look. But this is the standard. I resetted the camera in this morning. I made a reset, and the camera starts in 4K and asynchronous, and this is the starting point, and usually nobody complains about it. It's the contrast. In Germany, the Bayerischer Rundfunk, for example, they wanted to buy Ari Amira for the Ari look, and then they said, it's quite expensive, and perhaps we can switch to Sony asynchronous as well. And now they have FX9 and FX6, so they're using asynchronous as a replacement for the Ari look. And if you want to have Ari lookup tables in your shooting, you can even replace in the FX9 and FX6, you can replace asynchronous against a lookup table, and the lookup table is what you shoot. So it's the final look is the lookup table. So if somebody of you has the ultimate film look from Ari as a lookup table for S-Log, you can load it in the camera and shoot with it. And still do white balance, can still do format conversions, everything else. And this was not possible with the FS7, for example. There was no way of doing white balance with S-Log. And now you can do it in the FX9 and FX6 as well. Okay, this is just a very rough idea for 4 hours, very rough. So I think if we talk about the FX6, we talk about autofocus. This is why I put my models there, because there are some strategies for autofocus that are quite important, because sometimes it's not the question of autofocus, it's the question how to get out of autofocus again if something goes wrong. And I see camera people saying, oh my God, something happens, I don't know what to do, okay, switch it off. And this is the only idea they have, is to, hard switch off autofocus and do it manually instead of, thinking about autofocus, having a strategy. And this is a recommendation I would give to everybody. Don't buy the camera and go out shooting tomorrow with autofocus, because you probably mess it up. It's a good idea to take the camera, especially when unboxing, and simply use 2 days and set yourself aims. So make a target, follow some people, make a walk with people, try to switch from people to objects, from objects to people, have different people in the picture and decide which one is the people to focus on. This is something I want to simulate with our setup in a minute. So then I see a lot of functions are hidden on the assign buttons. We don't have hundreds of assign buttons, and some of them are easy to reach, like the button 7 and 8 or 1, 2, 3 on the side. And some buttons are hidden, like within the grip. So if you go into the grip and use your third finger, there's another button. This is number 6, and probably nobody can push it. I have 2 big hands, and I see some big hands in the front here as well. I would say you never can press button number 6, and probably you can also not push button number 5. 5 is record, and 5 is roughly there, and I cannot reach it at all. So there's, to be honest, only 1 button left on the zoom grip, and this is number 4 on top. And I will say, probably within this workshop, I will say, and this is a function we could use on button number 4. And I will take another topic and say, and this is another function you could put on button number 4. And this is your strategy. Some people do a lot of autofocus, and then I would say, okay, what about autofocus on the button number 4? Some other people will say, I need exposure help. I go from dark to brightness, from brightness to dark, like perhaps dancing through spots of light or something like that. And perhaps exposure is the most interesting thing. Perhaps then it's a good idea to put the Vari-ND filter on number 4, so that you don't have to lose contact to the camera with the left hand, but you can use it here, because this is one of the best buttons while shooting, at least when holding the camera this way or this way. If you hold it from top, because you're running, behind things, perhaps button number 7 and 8 is the best thing. And if you're shooting, however, it's a good idea to think of these 3 buttons, 1, 2, 3, for special functions. And there's another button, number 9, for example, here at the side. And that means you have to grab the display. Perhaps you can put, I don't know, peaking on it. Oh, there's a peaking button already. Okay, we don't put peaking on it. There's also a zebra button. Perhaps you put waveform monitor, magnifier for the viewfinder, whatever on button number 9. But let's see what we can do. So this is one of my recommendations. Let's talk about assign buttons and assign wheels, because there's one wheel that most people forget, and this is the menu wheel. The menu wheel itself can do a function, and most people don't know it. But this is not only pressing enter and go through the menu. This is also a function if you say, I want to have ISO on this button, on this wheel, or I want to have iris on this wheel. So this is an additional user wheel you can use. And at the moment I have nothing on it, as you see. Okay, we have to do it. Some people do ISO on it because they want to shoot at a certain f-stop, like f-stop 2.8, and they never want to leave 2.8. It's a good idea to put gain on it. Some other people want the iris on it. Some other people want ND filter on it or whatever. So we can go to the menu and see for that. Then I called it the dual ISO dilemma. This is something I sometimes see when shooting myself, and sometimes I see it if other people shoots, because we have native ISO 800, and there's a second ISO of 12,800. That's 4 stops more light, 24 dB for broadcasters, talking about dB. That's a huge difference, and the question is, how do they overlap? When do I switch to the high ISO level? And the other question is high ISO level, is it a marketing thing or is it a technology? Let's say it this way. And I try to always explain it with piece of glass or something, or glass of water, if this is a big glass and there's a lot of light coming in it, you usually don't fill it completely. You only fill it this way. This would mean a less light in a big glass. Or sometimes you fill it very much, like shooting outside with a lot of sun. And in former times, the companies like Sony, ARRI, Panasonic, etc., they had one converter, voltage to digital converter, with, let's say, 12-bit, 14-bit, 16-bit. 16-bit could theoretically solve 16 f-stops of light. And they put it on the sensor, and they have to decide if you go for a lot of light or if you go for less light. So they have to decide where to put it. And Sony and some other companies in the last years do dual ISO, so they have two ways of reading out. And now you can decide if you take the 16-bit and put it on the very low end of the glass, that means high ISO, so not a lot of light in the glass. Or you can put it on top of the glass, that means you need a lot of light. It's a switch in the camera, so you can switch it from, how do you say, a specialist for low light or a specialist for high light. And this is, well, now the crazy part begins. Let's see how Sony calls it. If you press the menu button just one time, you end up in the status page. There was a dedicated button on other cameras for this, like the small handheld cameras, or Z280, or FS5, FX9, and all these cameras, they usually have a dedicated status button. And if you press it, you end up on roughly 8 to 10 pages with information about the camera. This is combined in the FX6 in the button menu. So if you push it just once, you end up in the status page, and if you press it for 3 seconds, you get into the deep menu. Sometimes it's a little bit annoying. To me, it's sometimes annoying because I'm used to, oh, we have to change it. Okay, let's press the menu button. Ah, no, I'm not in the menu. I'm in the status page. Shit. So you have to get used to it, especially if you jump from one camera to the other one. You always end up in the status menu if you don't want. But the status menu on these cameras is not only a presentation menu or presentation page. You can completely edit it, and it's even touch screen, so not this one, there. You can also edit it if you go in and hit it by finger, but you can also drop in with the menu wheel. So if you go with the menu wheel and say, yes, I want to shoot XAVC, and I want to change the frequency, or I want to go from full frame to S35 to the small readout, it's possible to actually see this as a main menu or shortcut menu, because you can do nearly everything from there, especially switching from low sensitivity. You need a lot of light in the glass, to high sensitivity. You need just a little bit of light in the glass, and the 16-bit work for low light now, or the 16-bit work for high light, for a lot of light. So you can do it in this menu. There are a lot of more pages in the status page. Let's scroll to the main or the most important ones. This is page 1, saying the main things, let's say. The second page is about gain and white balance. Here you can also edit the gain settings for the buttons, for the switch, for the low, mid, high switch. You can even dial in, for example, if I press the button and I want to use high switch with 2 dB, 3 dB, you see how the picture changes. And the funny thing about dB, I'm not sure, perhaps we make a question. Most broadcasters think in dB, decibel, and they say 3 dB, 6 dB, 12 dB. Yeah, 6 dB is one stop. Who's used to work with dB settings? Okay, 4, 5 people, 6 people. Contract question, who's used to ISO? Okay, what about the rest? Okay, yeah, okay, this is the dB page. I like the camera to be in dB because if you make the picture brighter, for example, I'm in the setting high now with -1 dB, whatever -1 dB means. you can see that I can increase or decrease 1 dB steps. So that's very fine. And if you have 6 dB as one stop or a double of light, 1 dB means I'm switching in sixths, in part of six steps for one light step, for one doubling of light, 6 steps. If I switch the camera to ISO, it's only thirds. So there are some people that say, oh, the dB scale is much more finer. It's easier for me to make some adjustments with it, especially if you put ISO on the finger and say brighter, 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 darker, darker, darker. Then some people say, hey, the dB scale is nicer. On the other hand, if you're used to ISO values and somebody calls you, hey, set the camera to ISO 1600, then I would say, I don't know, 1600, what is it in dB? I have no idea. It's a good idea to make a comparison. For example, if we stand on 0 dB on the high level, so let's go into the main menu now and let's see how this translates. Let's go to the camera menu. They don't call the camera menu anymore camera menu. They call it shooting, why ever. And project setting is everything about, you know, the main settings within the camera, something like that. But this is the camera menu using the camera, and there's the main parameter ISO and gain. I can also put the menu up there if you like. Just a moment, so you can see it better there. I hope it works. Yeah. dB. So the switch on high. This is the camera is switched to high. So you have 3 presets. Is sitting on 0 dB at the moment, and let's switch it over to ISO. And now you see there are different values for ISO and dB, because 0 dB is not 1250 ISO. The main native ISO of the camera is 800 ISO. The funny thing is that 0 dB is a different value. I would never mind, because if you shoot on dB, simply put it to 0 dB, that's roughly ISO 320, I think. If you put it on ISO, the brightness changes, and just have in mind 800 is the native ISO. If you're shooting in low sensitivity. If we switch now to high sensitivity, it's hidden here in the menu down there, base sensitivity high. Now let's see how the values changed. The high value changed to 20,000 in this case. Let's have a comparison again. I will set it to, let's say, the low level to 12,800, because this is the native high value. Oh my God. And now switch back to the low level. And there you see it's changed back to 800. And if you want to know what 800 means or the difference means, it's roughly, if you say ISO with low and high, this was 800 versus 12,800, that's a lot. That means 800 by 2 is 1,600, 3,200, 6,4. And there, yeah. And this means plus 6 dB, or one stop, plus another one, so that's the second stop, the third stop. Is it right? There, one stop, second, third. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I got it. So it's 4 stops more light, not coming to the sensor, but the sensor is working 4 stops of light different on these 2 levels. And the noise pattern of the sensor is roughly the same. So physically, theoretically, 12,800 is a little bit more noise on the sensor itself, but not on the conversion. And that is something that we see. So it's actually, if I switch to 12,800 high mode, the camera starts from scratch, and you can even go higher in the ISO from this point. The funny thing and the confusion starts when you put it to low, so 800 as the starting point, and then you go, oh, let's do more. You go to 1,600. Oh, let's also see it. 1,600. Let's go to 3,200. Let's go to 6,400. Let's go to 12.8. 16, 20, 25. That's the maximum in low mode. I'm still in low mode. This is something people sometimes confuse, because other cameras switch their dual ISO in between. So you dial it up, and at a certain point the camera switches to the other sensitivity, like some alphas do or some DSLRs in general do. The question I put on Sony was, why don't you switch it automatically? It would be more convenient, because if I push the ISO, at a certain point the camera switches to the high value and the noise is gone. And then they said, just imagine you have a documentary and you're shooting in half low light. You don't need high sensitivity, you're shooting in low sensitivity, and you push a little bit of gain. At a certain point you say, okay, it's getting a little bit noisy, but it's okay, and now you need a little bit more gain. For editing, it's a good idea to stay within this noise level and have a little bit more gain, have a little bit more noise, but this intercuts with the first clip better than switching to the next level, just 500 ISO more, and suddenly the picture is noise-free. And then the editor has a problem, because if he intercuts those two pictures, like shot and, how do you say in English, Gegenshot, person 1, person 2, and you have one person noise-free just because you gave a little bit more ISO, and the other person is a little bit noisy, and they intercut don't well. So it's a better idea to stay within one ISO setting, low or high, if you just raise the ISO level a little bit. And this is the reason why Sony said it's your decision to switch between low and high. If you say, okay, I'm working on the high level from now on, then it's your decision. It's a switch that you have to move. There's no automatic system for it. There's absolutely no automatic for this. So you have to switch it yourself. You see it's going up to 25,600. Let's go to 1200 just as a comparison. And I will put in an ND filter for it so that we still have a, let's say, proper picture. And you're sitting quite close to the monitor. Can you say something about noise?
There's practically no noise.
Ah, no. Okay, you. Okay, you need some other glasses, I think. Just look on the screen. There's some working noise already. Yeah, okay, yeah. It's a nice. It's still a usable picture, obviously, but there is definitely noise. Yeah. And now let's do the experiment. I'm on ISO 12800, but base is low, so I'm on the low level, starting with ISO 800, and I pushed it to 12.8 at the moment. And now let's do it the other way around. So I'll go into the menu, I switch base ISO to high, probably, unfortunately, the ISO value switch. So unfortunately, you cannot start with 12,800 now. You have to dial it in. So I take the low level, like here, 200,000 ISO, and I push it back to 12.8. So this is 12.8 high. So this is the drawback. If you switch the low and high mode, the picture goes bam for a moment. And now judge the same noise pattern, please. What about the noise? now you can say what you did. Now you can say what you did. Okay, this is absolute cleaner now, really. If you're working in low light, roughly about 6,000 ISO minimum, it's a good idea to switch to the high mode, because you can lower this ISO value from. We are in high mode, right? The native ISO of high is 12,800, but you can also lower it a little bit, digital. So I lower it as far as I can, and stop is at 5,000. So native 12,800 can be lowered to 5, but not lower. So it's a bad idea to have high ISO outside, for example, for whatever reason, because you came from darkness to brightness, and you're still on high level, and you try to dial it down. 5,000 is the minimum in high mode. Yeah? If you go up, you can go up to 200,000, but you see 5,000 is a kind of switching level, a minimum level. If somebody says, I need a little bit less light, then I would say use the ND filter, use the iris, but you cannot use the ISO anymore because it's at the lowest point. That means probably something like, I would say something between 6,400 and roughly 8,000 or something is probably the switching point between high and low. So if you end up with 6,000, it's depending if you go into low light, then stay on high value. If you go into bright light, then it's a good idea to start 6,000 ISO in low level, because then you can dial it down. Let's have an experiment how low you can go in low mode. If you go outside, for example, you see it ends up with 25,600, and it's the lowest setting you can do is 320. That's the lowest value. That's perhaps enough to go outside and shoot with f-stop 2.8 or 2 with a full ND filter engaged with 50ths of a second, for example. ISO 320 is quite low, and now the absurd thing comes, you can go lower with dB. Because 300 ISO is 0 dB in the camera, and you can even lower it to -3 dB, so you can go lower on the dB setting, but ISO stops at 320. Just make your own experiments. If you're stuck with ISO, it's no problem at all, and you can communicate with other people better than talking about dB. But people that shoot just for themselves and just use dB, it's a finer stepping dB, and you can go half a stop lower with dB. For whatever reason, Sony couldn't explain me. I think it's a historical thing. In all the broadcast cameras, you usually could go in -dB, and I think Sony did, so let's not confuse broadcast camera people, let's put it with -3 dB on top so they can dial in -3 dB. I don't know if this is the strategy, but it could be the strategy. Okay, how do you change ISO values? First of all, you have 3 presets on the camera, low, mid, and high button. But they're related to high ISO and low ISO, as you saw. If you switch to high ISO, then you see sometimes a jump of light because the values are just 4 stops brighter. So you can edit them. First of all, you can edit them on this page, and I would really recommend it, because this page is so easy to find. And you say, I want to have 800 setting, or no, let's say for outside, I want to have 320 as the lowest setting possible. And perhaps I do the native ISO of 800, and perhaps I need a little bit highlight like 3200. Let's say this is your preset wish, and now you can switch it with the switch from 320 to 3200 on 3 steps. This is your preset button. If you are on a hurry and you are not in this menu, you see that you can select the ISO value with the button. And this is quite easy. Simply press one time the button, the dial, and then you can move within all underlined items. And this is quite a lot. You can set it the shutter speed. You can put the shutter speed from manual to automatic. You can go to ISO. You can even switch the ISO to automatic. Or you simply go to the ISO value and dial in whatever you want. But you are changing the L setting with this. Yeah, there are 3 settings: L, low, mid, high, 3 presets, and while dialing it, you're changing this. It's not a bad idea to do it, because you can simply stay in the viewfinder or look on the viewfinder, press enter, and dial in another ISO if you need to. Same with everything else. If you want to go to the ND filter, for example, you can dial in other values for the ND filter. This is one of the reasons to go for the FX6, because the alpha cameras don't have an ND filter, and the FX3, we built them up there, doesn't have an ND filter as well. Because, to be honest, the FX3 is a pushed alpha camera. And when I saw the FX9 and FX6 the very first time, there were some Japanese engineers as well. And I went to the FX9 and said, yeah, fantastic. It's the king of Sony cameras at the moment, full format, autofocus, ND filter, vari ND filter. And I say, and what about image stabilization? And then the Japanese engineer said, no. I said, this camera doesn't have image stabilization. You know, every alpha camera has it, and the FX3 has it. It's moving the sensor in all directions. And then I said, and the king, the flagship of cameras, doesn't have it? Why? And then he said, Uli, you're doing camera trainings for Sony for years now. What is the distance of the mount of E-mount? So if you have the camera, there's the E-mount, there's a sensor. And he said, how far away is the sensor from the mount, so from the outside? I said, I'm a tough guy, I know it exactly. It's 18 millimeters space between sensor and mount. So that's roughly less than a fingernail. And in former times, Sony said it's not possible to put an ND filter inside this space. This was the beginning of the large cameras. And later they did. And now they do a Vari-ND filter. So this is an LCD screen that can be tuned brighter and darker. And that's the Vari-ND filter. He said, if we put a ND filter inside and you drop it in, the sensor would hit the ND filter. So it's not possible to move it. He said, we can take away the ND filter and then the sensor can move. So what do you want? As a broadcast cameraman, as a movie cameraman, as a run-and-gun cameraman, do you want ND filter or stabilized sensor? You have to decide. If you go ND filter, you can go with FX6 and FX9. If the stabilized sensor is the absolute must for you, you have to go Alpha or FX3. That's the game. They could do both if they get rid of the E-mount. But obviously this would be a very, very bad idea for Sony because they have hundreds of lenses. Zeiss has lenses on E-mount. There are cinema lenses for E-mount. There are photographic lenses for E-mount. It would be a very bad idea of Sony saying, we're leaving E-mount, we do something new for having more space to move the sensor. What they did instead is there is a way of recording the movement of the camera in metadata. So there's a gyro inside measuring how the camera is moved. And this is recorded in real time into the file. And you can use an image stabilization that takes these data and doesn't guess how the camera was moved, because this happens if you use Premiere Warp Stabilizer. This happens if you use Resolve stabilization as well. They try to analyze the picture, like there's a person and something is moving around and the camera is moving around. And they try to interpret this as a 3D model and try to stabilize this material. And this is not necessary because the camera wrote their movement in the file, and you can take the data out of the file and say, please make a stabilization with it, because the plugin knows what happened to the camera. So it's no guessing. And I made some experiments with this because it's sometimes a little bit hard to present, but I want to show the experiments. I put it on YouTube some time ago. And this was the first footage. You don't see it, sorry. Is it there? Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. This was the first footage I shot on the FX6 in this case, because this is the same system. If you drop in clips that have stabilized metadata, well, this is the main word for everything that's written into files, metadata, so everything except video, except audio, except timecode comes into the file. And this is real-time metadata showing up in the Catalyst Browse software. I would always recommend, I can start it in a second as well, I always would recommend to download Catalyst Browse. It's a free of charge software. The only thing is you have to register with an email address, any email address. And Catalyst Browse can interpret all Sony footage, even the raw files, 4K, HD, S-Log, everything. You can grade the material, you can just play with the material, and you can look into the metadata, and you have the stabilizer. And it's free of charge. There is a charged version as well. The charged version can do batch processing. So you can put in 100 clips and say, please stabilize them. This single software can only stabilize one clip after each other. So you're stabilizing one clip, export, you take the next one, stabilize, export. If you want to do more or batch work, you must switch to the bigger version. But I just wanted to show this. There's one shot we did in the UK of this girl at the stair. And because I wanted to show the comparison of the stabilized footage and the non-stabilized footage, I dropped in the stabilized material in Premiere, and I made a clip-in-clip, picture-in-picture video out of it. So on the left and right, down there, you will see the original and the stabilized version. And in the middle, you will see an overlay of both. So you see the unstable video and an overlay of the stabilized on the same picture. So probably each time the picture wobbles, the plugin does something, so does the stabilization. So probably it's easier to show it than talking about it. I will hit play in a second. And let's see what happens. Let's make it big. So the right side is processed. Can you please go away? And the left side is the original, and the overlay in the middle, each time it wobbles, this is a part of a situation where stabilization worked or was processed. I will start it from scratch in a moment. This is the overlay again, just pure. Oh no, this is the stabilized version. Yeah, it's not the overlay. And this is simple handheld. Let's start from scratch. Okay, again. Yeah.
You should take into account the framing then.
Yeah, of course. Every stabilization in Premiere, Resolve, this one, zooms in a little bit to move the picture. But you can, you have a percentage value where you can decide how far you go in the stabilization. There's a setting. But yes, you have to shoot a little bit wider than usual, or make a frame for yourself for, you know, knowing that I will stabilize. Yeah.
What's your experience with the warp stabilizer in Premiere?
It's very capable, but you have to tune it. That's especially, I made some comparison from warp stabilizer against the metadata. The funny thing is the warp stabilizer or even Resolve sometimes end up with wobbling backgrounds because the stabilizer thinks, because the stabilizer thinks that the person in the middle is the stable thing. But sometimes you say, I'm wobbling from left to right, the person in the middle is not the, stable thing. But the camera knows that you're moving the camera from left to right, and the stabilizer will move the picture accordingly and not look for a thing in the middle. That's why even in this example you see a lot of wobbling on the left. No, this is not, this is original, sorry. But I think I also have a warp stabilizer comparison. Just give me a second. Yeah. Okay, warp, warp against metadata. Okay, the unfair thing of this is the right side is cropped in a little bit more than the left side. But it's, anyway, it's impressive.
Will this work for the FX3 as well?
There's a gyro stabilizer. I'm not sure. I have to look for this because there are some drawbacks with the metadata as well. Let's talk about it, but I can answer this in a second. Because in general, you would say you have on the FX6 stabilized lens, perhaps, and the internal stabilizer, and you cannot combine the metadata with the physical stabilizer anyway. So it's a better idea anyway to go with a stabilizer in the camera, because then it's already the finished picture in 4K or HD. We're cropping into this picture a little bit for the stabilization. So it wouldn't be a good idea to use metadata there anyway, I would say. Just to shorten this, I will show you the software for that. It's called Catalyst Browse. And it's a good idea anyway to install this if you work with Sony footage. And if you have writers or colleagues or other camera people, it's a good idea to recommend it to them, because this software always shows the time code of clips, even if you do proxy clips, preview clips. It works multi-audio, multi-channel audio. It can be stabilizing clips. And it has a complete S-Log workflow if you, for example, have, I'm not sure, let's, can I make a small vote? Who's quite familiar with S-Log? Who's a beginner to S-Log? Nobody? Okay, who never heard of S-Log before? Oh, okay, that's also, yeah, okay, a little bit. For example, this is an S-Log picture we have in the software. So the software looks into the metadata and loads the right lookup table. So this is the easiest way to watch S-Log footage. Somebody shot S-Log and you don't know what it is. You simply drop it in this software, switch the button zurücksetzen, set back, because then the metadata are read. For example, if you completely mess up the parameters, you start grading for yourself and say, yeah, that's the right look to go, and oh, there are some color buttons here, we can try something with this, and now I have the finished film look. Then you simply press zurücksetzen, and what it does is it takes the S-Log signal and loads the lookup table that you used in the camera. At least it looks for the name of the lookup table. It doesn't take the lookup table from the camera. So this is the picture that comes out, and you will tell me where the problem of this clip is. It was a UPS driver just coming by, so probably you saw the problem. There was one clip in the one part in the middle where you exactly can see nothing on the box anymore. But because it's S-Log, there's a lot of headroom in the background, in the tops, and there's a lot of background in the shadows. And I'm always a little bit funny about people saying, we don't have time to grade. We have no time for color correction. And then I say, this is not color grading. This is just 2 or 3 buttons or sliders. It's not a creative process. It's just moving the exposure down again, for example, and just bring it back. As long as you shot S-Log in a certain way, and if you still have headroom, we can bring back the headroom. And also you could see what this guy has for lunch, because you can also push the exposure and see what he has on lunch in the car, for example. But this is giving gain. And because this is giving gain, it's getting noisy. So pushing dark parts in S-Log up produces a lot of noise in the worst case. Pushing things down usually makes no noise because you're far away from the noise level in the highlights, and you can bring it down. And even if some people shoot completely wrong white balance, like this one, this would be unrepairable, just a moment, unrepairable if this is a final shot. If you shoot this in an FS5, FS7, FX6 without S-Log, you will see the skin is already white, so there is no color information in the skin tones anymore. In the head, there's no. You see that the sky is already cyan colored, so obviously there's a color missing. It's already clipped. If you look into the waveform monitor, if you're familiar with waveform monitors, you will see blue is clipped, green is clipped, red is clipped, and you cannot bring this information back usually. This is a point where you shoot S-Log, because S-Log is not this recorded picture. S-Log is this recorded picture, but unfortunately it's very low saturated, there's no contrast, there are no right colors, so you need a development of the picture. That's usually a lookup table making this picture. And now I could say, hey, I'm a colorist with 3 parameters, with three sliders: exposure, color temperature, magenta, green. Let's try. Bring down exposure. Change white balance to, let's say, roughly about 4,000 or so, and it's a little bit too magenta. Perhaps I put a little bit more green inside. Yeah, color grading done. So this was before, this is after. This is absolutely no creative process. This is just a correction process, and it takes really a minute or so. And you can do it in Premiere or Resolve as well if you have the lookup table. So this is my recommendation, to use this software if you ever have something to do with any material coming from any camera and you have to interpret it. Okay, I think I didn't ask if you are smokers, or I'm not a smoker, but I'm absolutely on drugs with coffee. So I see that I'm decaffeinating now. Let's make a small break and then concentrate on focus. Let's focus on focus. Okay? Perfect. Yeah. Okay, perhaps we focus on autofocus. Okay. This is definitely, do you see the picture? Yes, this is definitely not an autofocus lens, obviously. I took this picture because I made this picture in Vienna on a camera workshop. And there was one guy showing up with this setup. There's a monitor on top of it that you cannot see, but he has a top monitor as well. Because this is an anamorphic, quite cheap anamorphic lens. And a lot of people say, especially in the internet, it's not possible to use anamorphic lenses on the FX6. Theoretically, it's not possible for two reasons. First of all, the anamorphic picture on the sensor is that size that you have to zoom in afterwards. In post-production, you have to zoom into the picture, and you zoom beyond resolution of HD. So actually, you're zooming so far in to make the picture fill the screen that the resolution drops, theoretically. But this guy films every day with the lens, and he says, well, who cares about numbers? Geoff Boyle, the DOP of England, he once made a presentation, said, fuck the numbers. Because he said, oh, you German guys, you always calculate numbers and say the picture is good or bad. Just look at the picture. And he's right. So his experience was you can do anamorphic full frame with the camera. You have to zoom in a lot to fill the picture. You zoom beyond HD limit, but it still looks great, and the picture tells everything. I wanted to ask him to send me some pictures of his work, but I didn't get it yet. So in general, it's possible, but only with this camera if you use an external monitor that squeezes the picture so you see a normal picture. Otherwise, you have a distorted picture. The FX9, that's the main difference, can work with anamorphic lenses. First of all, this is a 6K sensor in full frame, so you don't zoom in beyond the resolution limit. And the second is the viewfinder can squeeze the picture, so you have a normal picture in the normal viewfinder. Viewfinder, there's no anamorphic way in this viewfinder, so what he did is he put this to the backside, you can mount it here, and put an Atomos Small HD or whatever monitor on top, and that squeezes the picture for anamorphic. That's a way you can do it. In our setup, we have the kit lens, so-called kit lens. It's roughly 5 times zoom, and the question is, what about this lens? It's stabilized, so it's an internal stabilizer inside. It's motorized, so you can change iris by motor, you can change the zoom by motor, you can change the focus by motor, but you can switch the lens completely to manual mode if you move this ring, because this is a switch. If you switch it to the camera, you're moving the lens elements itself, and you have a mechanical focus with hard stops. This is something that, for example, broadcast camera people with shoulder cameras really like, because they know focus point there, focus point here, focus point there, focus point here. And it's always hard stop. You can make markers, and it's always right. If you switch it to the front, you can use autofocus, macro focus, but you can dial in focus a little bit. It's an endless ring now. Some people don't like it, but this is the way most photo lenses work. The ring usually don't have hard stops. It's an endless ring. And some people like it and some people don't like it. So this lens combines both. It's a nice zoom lens because on the one hand it's cheap, quite cheap. On the other hand it's f4, f-stop 4. And some people say, oh, f-stop 4 is not so great. But think of FS7. In the FS7 times, a lot of people bought zooms with f-stop 2.8. And if you convert it to full frame, it's roughly f4. So f4 on a full frame camera is not that bad. Of course, if I take 1.4 full frame, okay, that's a different beast, of course. But this is not a zoom at all. And it's, I would say, nearly as heavy as this lens. So it's a nice general broadcast lens, let's say. If you want to make interviews or if you want to make very specific things, then probably you change to either cinema zooms or to photo lenses or whatever you like to prefer. So this, let's look for the autofocus. And there's perhaps one more I must say, the FX6 usually doesn't have this mount. The LCD screen is mounted with a very simple mechanism to the grip. And it's not usually not capable, and it's not part of the FX6, the viewfinder tube. This is actually the viewfinder tube that's coming with the FS7 or FX9. The funny thing is they made already the same hooks on the FX6, so you can use the FX9 or FS7 tubes on the FX6, but the holder isn't strong enough to hold it. So Sony definitely said the FX6 is not a camera for iTube, but they make the hooks on the LCD screen pretending, hey, you can use a tube, but the holder is not strong enough. Usually if you put it on, it goes like something like there. And you have to fiddle a way around to make it stronger, or, well, we are at Vocas, and Vocas does a lot of gear to make cameras better. And this is a Vocas construction to hold the display, so you can tighten it and you can put it in different positions if you want to work with professionally with a tube viewfinder. So everyone who goes for the FX6 for real shoulder work should think of a holder to make this really tight. And people that say, I just want to hand hold the camera and I don't do shoulder, I don't need a tube, they can go with the standard setting, of course. But just to mention this, because a lot of people think the tube is part of the FX6, but the FX6 is more a handheld style designed camera, and the FX9 is more a shoulder designed camera. That's the reason why there's a different way of mechanism for the tube. But it's the same LCD holder, so you can use the tubes on both of them. Regarding the lens and the picture that you see, as you see, I have the model, and it's already doing face recognition. And I think if you are working the first time with FX6, or if you want to professionalize in autofocus, you really have to think about some things. One of the things is the small man or woman there. It's saying we have face recognition switched on. The nice thing is you can go with the direct menu, so just hit enter and move around, and you can even grab the autofocus symbol up there and press enter, and you can switch off face recognition at all, or you switch to face priority or to face only, or you switch off face recognition. If you switch it off, the autofocus is as stupid as any autofocus, just looking for something interesting. If you switch face only, this is a typical interview setting. So the camera will only focus on faces, on nothing else. So of course, if you have a product presentation and you go to face and then you move down to the object, the camera will say, no face, no focus, no autofocus. You have to focus manually. If you are on face priority and you leave a face, then the camera is allowed to focus an object. So you can switch between an object and a face and an object and a face just by moving the camera. This is why I have some funny setup here. For example, let's move from her to the chart, and at a certain point I will drop the focus at all and the camera goes back into focus. I hope so. No, it doesn't? Yeah. Did it? Yeah, okay. So switching between a person and an object is a good idea to have autofocus set on face priority. As long as I come back to a face, probably the camera finds back the face, and you can even touch faces, and that's the main difference between FX6 version 3 and version 2. There are some new autofocus improvements. For example, you can touch objects and track them. So up till now, there was a face recognition, and if the face was walking around, the camera was following the focus, but it didn't do this with objects. So an object was just sharp or not sharp, focused or not focused. And now you can just grab any objects like the camera and tap it, and there's a small window. It looks like the face recognition window because this is a tracking window. Tracking is always represented as a small tracking. This is a window with some speed lines, like a comic drawing. There's something moving. is the tracking window, and it's tracking now the focus wheel of the camera. And if you move the camera, you would see even the camera is tracked, though it's not a face. Yeah, this was version 2, or the former versions like FX3 and FX9 and FX6. With the new firmware updates, it's now possible to just hit an object and track it, even if it's not a face. There was one question.
Can you set the focal point, like left center, right center, left corner, right corner?
Yes, and I would always recommend to put this on 2 buttons, because you remember when I made the introduction, I said, let's talk about user buttons, because if you go into the menu and you want to have the autofocus area in the, let's say, left upper right, for example, or smaller or bigger, yeah. Then usually you go into the focus setting. Either you have the focus setting in the user menu. It's a good idea to make your own user menu. User menu means you can do your own settings. And it's a really good idea to take 1 hour or 2 hours and make your own user setting and save it, because those people who always change ISO values, they can put ISO on top of the user menu. And if you do a lot of focus settings, then put the focus setting there. If you do a lot of in-camera color grading, put the color values in the user menu and save it. So it's a good idea to have your own user menu with the main most important things. I didn't do it. This is the Sony. I made a reset, so this is the Sony recommendation. There's a focus page existing out of, what is it, 7 values? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's a good idea. Is it? Yeah. A focus menu, 7 points. First of all, there's a transition speed. What does it do? This is exactly the speed that the camera needs if it's focusing from near to far. How long does it take? So how long do you want the movement to take place? 7 is very fast. Is it 7 or 5? I don't know. I have to look. 7, yeah. 7 is very fast. And 1 is really, really creeping slow. And then there's a second parameter, probably more important. This is how fast is the camera reacting to new situations? So if one person goes away, another person comes, or one person goes away and the camera is supposed to focus on an object, is the object interestingly at once or later? And I will try to show it now, that there's a delay of roughly 5 seconds if you go from responsive, what means new objects are very interesting and the camera is allowed to do new objects instantly. Or if you say locked on means please keep on the same focus area even if your object is gone. Keep as long as possible in this area because perhaps it comes back, like a person turning around, coming back. Probably you don't want the camera to focus on the background. 2 ways of doing it. First way is face only. If I'm face only focused, I can turn around and show something. The camera will stay in this area because there's no other face. If I come back with the face, the camera will jump back to me. So it doesn't leave this focus pane. The second way to do it is switch on locked. The camera, as soon as I turn away, takes roughly 5 seconds time of waiting for me. If 5 seconds if the face doesn't come back, the camera says, okay, the face is gone, let's try something else. And then the camera looks for something else. For example, even if you do faces and the tree is hanging, sometimes in the picture, you don't want the camera to focus on the tree meanwhile. But perhaps it's just 1 second, 2 seconds, and the leaves or the tree goes away again. So the camera has roughly 5 seconds of delay to look for other things, for interesting things. I think, first of all, let's try responsive. And your question was, can I limit the zone, the focus area? There are 3 main definitions of areas. First, the wide definition. This means everything in the picture, on the whole screen, on the whole display, is capable of triggering the autofocus. So the face can be left, the face can be right, an object can be somewhere. So there's no setting for white because white is everything. If you go to zone and press enter, you will see a small yellowish frame. And you can move the frame either with the joystick on the zoom grip, or you can use the finger and move it around. And this was your question, if you put it on the upper right, for example, this is the focus area that the camera is looking for. So faces must be in this area, objects must be in this area. And if this is too big, you can even go to flexible spot. Spot is just a small center frame, and you can also move it around tap it. Yeah, you can use the joystick on the hand grip. There's a joystick to move it left and right, or put it back into the middle. There's a way of putting it in the middle. I think pressing long. It's on the hand grip itself. There's a small button that you can move up and down and left and right.
Then you first have to push the menu button on.
That's a good question.
Can you do it while filming?
Yeah, just wait 4 minutes. Yeah, you must do it with your eye, you know. Now, there's a way, yeah, of course, there are even 2 ways. Just wait some minutes, I will cover this in a minute. As long as this frame is yellow or orange, you can move it with a finger or with a joystick. If you press enter, let's say I move it to the camera or to the focus wheel, and now I press enter, I'm going back to my main menu, or even if I leave the menu, the frame is still there. Probably you don't see it so good. The frame is still there, and the focus is taking place in this part. Okay, now what about the face? You see the face is recognized because there's a frame around the face, but it's not focusing the face yet, because then the frame would be white. So faces that are recognized, they do get a frame, but the frame is not white. And some people always ask me about this orange line. This is a cursor. You can move it to the left or to the right with the joystick button and select a face. Obviously, it's easier to select a face by finger. So if you have the open area, you can perhaps better touch it. But in this case, if you say you have the tube, you have the camera on the shoulder, you cannot touch the screen, then you can use the joystick and move the cursor to the left or to the right and select a person and press enter. In my case, the focus area is, as you saw, how do I show it? There, is on the right middle side, roughly. And now let's see how the face reacts to it. So usually you think the face must fit inside this area to be recognized. But the method is different, and it's good because, yes, there are some pens. Because in general, if this is a face recognition, there's a big frame around the face, and if the camera sees an eye, it will switch to the eye. But it still sees internally a frame around the face. And if this face hits our focus mark, then the face is focused. So it only needs to touch this area, because usually you think, oh, this is really a very, very small area. But let's see how the faces react to this. Like the person in the middle, I'm moving the camera to the left, and now it's switched on. Do you see that? Can you follow this? Because the frame around the person hits the focus frame. Even if the eye is now only showing in white, but the face frame is bigger and the face frame is touching this small area. That means if you really want to focus on one person, let's say a speaker, then just move this spot to the right position and he just has to touch it. So he can even move a little bit or shake the head or something like that. Even if the frame is here, it doesn't matter, as long as he touches the frame. So this is one method of selecting, let's say, one person out of others. Then there's the so-called registration. If you have several faces, you can press enter on the joystick as well to so-called register a person. That means the camera tries to remember this person. To be honest, sometimes this works and sometimes, mostly, it doesn't work. If people look too similar, the camera looks for skin tone and for a general shape or whatever. Sony says it's artificial intelligence and so on. Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. So if I move this away, I come back to her. She's not recognized, but see what happens. Now the camera says, this is probably our person in the background. So probably this doesn't work. Let's see if it works on the person again. and you see, no, this didn't work. Or perhaps I didn't touch it, I don't know. Or I touched it on instance, I don't know. So to be honest, registrating a person, remembering a person, I think doesn't work in practice so good. It's a better idea to limit the focus to a spot, like we did before, make a small selection of spot, or say the complete area can be focused, whatever. And there's, of course, the tracking an object, like touching the camera. So let's pretend to do this again, that you can do it in general in any situation. I would do 2 recommendations. You saw that there are some parameters for the camera, like white, zone, and spot. 3 settings. Then you have the setting speed and sensitivity. Usually you have to go into the menu to switch these things, and this is sometimes annoying. I would recommend to go to the menu, to the button menu, and if you're really using autofocus a lot, then go to user buttons. And perhaps I give you a short overview what user buttons or what user functions are possible or able. Yeah?
Quick question, maybe I didn't listen well, but you cannot select a face when multiple faces are in the frame. You cannot select a face with a finger and say track that face and no other faces.
It's working a little bit different. Yes, you can select a face, but in general, touching the face leads to tracking. And the camera, how do you say? In this case, it doesn't matter if it's a face or if it's a computer, because in the moment you touch it, there's a frame around the object, and the object can be a person or an eye or an ear, and it's tracking this object. So it doesn't matter to see a face or an eye, because you're simply touching it, and it says, okay, I will track the area that you touched. This was before perhaps an automatic face recognition, and now it's your selection of, let's say, the eye or the ear. You can also track an ear if you like. Yeah. So yes, you can hit with the button. You can hit a person, but you will see that the symbol changes to tracking, to a tracking object. So a face becomes an object, but it doesn't matter because the same method works. But this is when I say try to practice, try to exercise this. If you have 2 days, simply make a setup like I have one person and I want to focus on one person and no other person around running to me. I want to switch from the person to an object and back to the person. This is something you can practice, and then you take a second person to it, or make a setup like me on a different focus area, and then you must practice. I just want to have this person and the other person is absolutely uninteresting. And now you have different methods. You could say, I'm trying to limit the zone, the focus point, to the left person. And the face recognition will only see this person as long as you don't move the camera. This is very good if you make moderation or live reporters in the city. Because in the city, there's the live moderator and some people walk and wink, they start winking. So it's a good idea to make the spot on this person, to concentrate on this person only. Sony says you can register the person and the camera won't look to other persons. I would say perhaps it works, perhaps it doesn't work. I wouldn't rely on that. The second really way to do it is switch off the autofocus as long as the person is here. And if you don't work with f1.4, you could say I'm focused, the person doesn't move, standing there with the microphone, why not switching off the autofocus? Unfortunately, the only way to do it is the switch in front, to make a hard off, hard on, hard off. Or perhaps you have a lens with a switch with autofocus on and off. There you can switch it to manual as well. There is a shortcut for it. There is a button for user buttons, but unfortunately it's only the push on and off. That means as long as you press, it will be switched on, or if it's on, as long as you press, it will be switched off. So it's a kind of autofocus is working, autofocus is working. I don't want to have it working, and I press the button, and as long as I hold it, the focus will stay in this area. This is a kind of emergency off, let's say. Many people work the other way around. They say, I walk through the city and there's a person and I say, give me the autofocus, and now I'm taking my own way. So hitting the push autofocus for a moment, getting the focus, and then I work manually. Or I switch on the switch. Unfortunately, there's no software switch, so there's no way of pushing a button somewhere, like here, and switch the autofocus generally on and generally off. Unfortunately, Sony didn't do this yet. A lot of people already have the recommendation for Sony to do it, because this would be helpful. But let's see what user buttons we can use for the autofocus. If you go to the user buttons, there's a huge and giant list, so many functions, much too many. The first, let's say, 10 settings are exposure. So you have base, ISO, and sensitivity switch. So you can switch between low and high with the button. Auto gain, push auto gain, ND filter, push auto ND filter. So you can even do exposure with the ND filter by pushing. Auto iris, that's all exposure. Push auto iris, bokeh control. That we will see in a moment with when I switch to this lens, because this makes more fun with this. Auto shutter, auto exposure, we're still with exposure, backlight and spotlight, exposure changes. And then comes white balance. Preset white, RTV, automatic tracking white, RTV hold, and then we start with autofocus. So first was exposure, then white balance, now autofocus. You see this is a combined button. You see this is called autofocus, speed, and sensitivity. 2 parameters in one. If we select this, I'm on button number 2. Let's see what happens if I push the button. I can change the speed, and if I push it the second time, I can set the sensitivity with one button without going to the menu. I would recommend, if you always struggle with the speed of autofocus or with the sensitivity, it's a good idea to put it on a button, because you must not go into the menu. So this would be recommendation number 1. The second one is already selected. You find the word focus setting. This is 2 things in one as well, and this makes the most sense. If you select this one and you press the button number 3 for a long time, let's say 1 or 2 seconds, you get in the shortcut for the white, zone, and spot. And this is something you quite often change. If you, for example, do some interviews, you would say, I want to have a spot on the person, and then you take away the camera and you walk around and you want to have this face or autofocus on this. You need a wide area or short area or spot, and you move the spot and something like that. Let's say you have spot. Then you see, oh, I have it on the wrong position. You can move it with a joystick or the finger, but at a certain point you will say enter, because you want to move to other parameters. You work with something different, and sometimes this area is not orange anymore, but it's perhaps gray, like now. If it's gray, just hit the same button short. You know, the selection of white, zone, and area, just hit it short, and the area will go to orange again. So this is a dual function. If you hit it once, it gets orange and you can move it. And if you press it for a long time, it will switch to white, zone, and spot. And I would say this is most important, to switch between those modes and move the spot around, because this is everyday situation. Yeah. If you want to have a push autofocus, for example, on button number 4, now the first time that we say button number 4, because this is so convenient. You're holding the camera, perhaps on shoulder, you have the grip, and the only button you can press without taking the hands away from the camera is button number 4. Because with this button, well, you could perhaps reach one of the, depending on the lens, I'm not sure, but I would say button number 4 is the best button to press with run and gun. So we could try it, but I don't use button number 4. I will take, for example, button number 1. And there's a push autofocus, manual focus. So just remember this one. And as long as autofocus is not on, and I will move the focus away, you can simply push the button and the camera will focus to the point that you have or to the next face, depending on your setting. Let's try. I push it, and the camera gives me the face, yeah, within this frame. That's okay. If the autofocus is working all the time, like now, so I can move it, and you see there are different faces recognized, and the camera focuses to the face in the spot. What happens if I want to move the camera to her, but I want to keep him in focus? Then I will bypass the autofocus, for example, with the push button. So you don't have to use the switch, but you can simply push the button, because this switches off the autofocus now, as long as I press. And now I can move the camera around without losing 2.4 meters. Just in case I let the button go again, the camera is focusing back. So it's a question, do you want a push for focus, or do you want the push for not focus? Or you switch it off completely, yeah? Is that okay? Oh, yeah, so a lot of, it's a kind of strategy. So some people say, I want autofocus all the time because I want to follow these people. But what happens if the camera starts going crazy? So, yeah.
You can also
Yeah.
enlarge your aperture, so
Yeah.
you have more depth.
That's just, thank you for, that's the nicest key, how do you say, the nicest agenda, smart saying, because I want to show something now. We had it yesterday in the course, but I didn't show it because it doesn't make extremely sense with an f4 lens. So I would say I will change the lens, and then let's talk about bokeh control or bokeh control. There's a funny thing. You all know the dolly zoom shot, yeah, dollying while zooming, keeping the person in the same size, but the background shifts. At a certain point, Sony said, if you put the ND filter, it's a Vari ND filter, it's getting bright and dark, to automatic, and the iris on automatic, and you change the iris, not in automatic, but manually, the ND filter will go against the iris. So if you close the iris, the ND filter will open because the ND filter says, oh, the picture is getting too dark. And what happens if you close the iris? The depth of field gets bigger. Also you have a sharper picture in the background, but the brightness stays the same because the ND filter does the exact opposite. But you were always dependent on exposure. And at a certain point, Sony said, why don't we put a setting inside? It's called, well, where was it? Bokeh control, where we do this as a combination of iris gain and ND filter. So actually this is not dependent on the exposure, it's just dependent by turning the wheel. And I try to make the setup. First of all, I have to change the lens because it makes absolutely more fun with this lens, because this is f1.4 and this is not 1.4, this is 4, and probably it makes more fun with the other lens. Okay, let's see. Okay, looks a bit weird now, but doesn't matter. Okay, first of all, I'm following the manual. And I'm following the given, can you listen away? It's not my camera, it's not my lenses, therefore I follow the rule, yeah. Sony recommends it. To be honest, no, I don't switch off the camera when it's my own camera. But there was one happening, it's years ago, when the Metabones adapters were very popular. The very first Metabones adapter unfortunately slid over the power connectors of the E-mount. And in Cologne there were a lot of FS7 killed, the mount was killed by the first charge of Metabones adapters. And it was clearly Metabones' fault, let's say, because the contacts were a little bit too big, and if the camera was on power, you slid over the power connector and it got hot, the pins got hot, and they got stuck. And suddenly you had a lens saying, no f-stops, and you pressed the Metabones, and suddenly it said, yeah, f8. And then it was loose and it got lost again. And it was about broken pins or melted pins, because this got too hot. This was one experience when I heard, oh, we changed such a lot of amounts of E-mounts, that I said, okay, if I do the presentations, I will switch off the camera so it doesn't happen to me, and I don't want to break a camera. If I break mine, but not another one. No, in general, I don't switch off the camera. And I trust that you can change E-mount, even powered E-mounts on the go. But if you look into the manuals of your gear, let's say mixers, mixing boards, recorders and all the things, probably everybody says, please switch off the unit when connecting SDI cables, because there could be some power capacity or some voltage or whatever while connecting. It clearly says switch off the unit. Nobody switches off a camera when connecting an SDI cable. Also, no, probably nobody. You do, probably. What's your experience, by the way, with this? With connecting cables or changing E-mount, etc.? Is there some experience in-house?
Yes, so we are more and more getting used to 12G SDI, and 12G SDI is getting more and more sensitive. So we should start worrying about connecting 12G SDI in the future. But with 3G, it was not that big of an issue in the past.
Yeah.
It's getting more and more.
And what about changing lenses on E-mount? Did you have trouble with some repairs or something in this regard? Or
Yeah, again with the metabones as well. But yeah, it says it in the manual, so officially you have to say yes. But
okay, read the.
I mean, photography guys also work with a lot of switching lenses and
Yeah.
to do it as well.
Okay, answer. Whatever. Okay, this is back to our picture. This is f-stop 1.4, ISO 640. I'm already on ND, as you see, so perhaps I can open up the ND a little bit as far as possible. And now the fun parts come. I will put bokeh control on the user button. Probably it is already, yeah. And what happens if I switch on bokeh control? It's button 1, right? One, it says bokeh control on. Yeah, so nothing happens. But if you close the iris now, and I do it by doing going to the menu there. Where's the iris? Sorry, I don't see it. Yeah, there. Okay, I will close the iris, and you watch the picture. Did you get it?
Yes.
If I move the iris value, the ISO will raise. And this is a cross algorithm. So this is not dependent on the exposure, but this is just going, if he turns down the iris, I will push up the gain. Let's say it again. I will push down the iris and the gain. You see, linked with gain, everything, all the steps I do, push the iris down, the gain will raise, and I have a deeper depth of field. So sometimes it's, it's a gimmick. So sometimes it's.
ND also moving?
I'm not sure. Well, in general it can move, because you see the number B is connected to B on the ISO. So if I would go the other way, but I cannot open the iris more. No, I switched on. When you switch on the bokeh control, the algorithm looks the situation. And if the ND filter was already set, and it will use, because it cannot make the ND filter brighter than 1/4, then it will raise the gain. If there's some space or some headroom on the ND filter, it will lower the ND filter first. That's why there's the B for bokeh control on the ND filter and on the ISO. So they work vice versa.
It's iris and
the iris is the iris is boss. Yeah, iris is boss, and if the picture needs to be brighter, then it lowers the ND filter to 1.0 to 1/4, and if it's not possible to lower it again, the ISO will raise. So that's the main thing. It's sometimes funny if you make a product video of a bottle, for example, and you make it swoosh with a depth of field or something like that. It's a gimmick, let's say. It's a creative gimmick. But we talked yesterday, I think, half an hour about it, and I said, okay, we must show it and just have a look on it.
If
So
you don't have it internally, it's a very expensive external thing called Cinefate from C-Motion. So
Ah, okay.
Internally.
Motorizing these things, yeah, okay. Sometimes we did this in post-production as well by masking a person and then, blurring the background, but you have to mask the person perfectly. So it's a nice tool. For example, I could imagine that, for example, a wedding with a couple that you're shooting on profile, so they're sitting like you two. Sorry, I don't want to marry you, but if one person is in focus and the other person is not, and you just want to dial in a little bit more sharpness, depth of field, of course you can calculate in your head, if I close the iris and then I put some gain and I have to somehow manage it. But you could also switch on bokeh control and move the amount of sharpness for both people. And then you have both in focus. But of course, at the price of gain or at the price of ND filter moving. I would say one last thing to the ND filter, perhaps in this topic. ND 1/4 is 2 stops of light, half and half. Yeah, 1/2 of light, 1/2 of light is 1/4. And this is the lowest setting the camera can do. Sometimes, if you move the ND filter, let's say I have the ring for it, and you can move it to, let's say, 1/23 or 1/8 or whatever. Sometimes, if you go lower than 1/4 with the dial, it could happen that at a certain point the camera says, I will take it out. Unfortunately, I think I already said it. Let's look into the menu. Sorry? This is always happening. Let's look into the technical menu. And there's one entrance saying ND dial. And this says you can also clear out the ND filter with the dial. So if I turn it all the time down, it didn't work at the moment, but I don't know why. Perhaps I didn't turn it fast enough. The camera is allowed to clear out the ND filter while you're shooting. So if you dial down 1/8, 1/4, and even down, suddenly the camera makes and it makes a noise and it makes the picture, it breaks the picture. It's a good idea to prevent this by not allowing the camera to do it automatically. So if you put it to off, the camera is not allowed to push in the ND filter automatically or push it out automatically. It's your decision to press plus or minus to bring it in or to bring it out. The camera cannot do it on itself, because this could be a worse situation. You put it on automatic, for example, and you move the camera into the darkness and suddenly it makes and it's in the middle of the shot. So it's a good idea to take this off. Just point there. Okay, I would say we roughly managed half the time of the workshop, and I would say let's make a coffee break or have a snack, but don't put the snack in the bag, okay? Okay. That was the most. Yeah, that's usually what I do with students if they come 10 minutes late. So did you write it? That was the most important. Yeah. Okay. There was just a question coming from you if it's possible to have one microphone on different channels with different values, with different gain values. And we just had a try. I put a microphone on channel 1, and as you see, this is the camera setting on the status page. I think setting audio in the status page makes more fun than in the menu, because in the main menu it's hundreds of parameters, and here you see channel number, metering, input source, gain, so main sensitivity, and wind filter. Well, wind filter is of course not a filter. For wind, it's just a low cut. It cuts quite high. So Sony is known for cutting at a very high value, roughly about 400 hertz or something, if it's called wind filter, because it takes away a lot of bass against noise of wind. So usually I say a wind filter is not something for the menu, it's something for the microphone. So you put it on the microphone, not in the menu. But in emergency case, of course, you can do it. And in this case, we put the input 1, microphone number 1, on 4 channels. we put it on channel 1 and made some sensitivity, so you can dial in your sensitivity. You can switch the second to auto if you like, then a little A is in front of the channel number 2, or you can switch it off. And channel number 3 and 4, you can switch it to manual mode as well, but there's no switch for it. You must go into the main menu and switch it there, or you have to use your finger and touch it, because then you can switch between gain as a value and automatic mode. But if I switch, I have to try. I don't do it that often, but you see there is no single value for channel 3 and 4. There's just a general value on the left bottom. It's called audio input level 99, and that's the level for channel 3 and 4 combined, but you can even do it on a single basis if you go into the main menu. In general, most people take microphone 1 and 2 or whatever for channel 1 and 2, and 3 and 4 are just the internal microphone or whatever. If you need more XLR, you can have a small XLR box and put it on the hot shoe, or a wireless receiver on hot shoe, because then you don't need no cables, because the signal goes straight through the hot shoe with contacts into the camera. That's the most convenient way to have channel 3 and 4, but unfortunately it works only if you have the grip and the handle if you have the handle mounted on the camera, because the contact is going through the handle to the hot shoe. And if you plug in something here, then it goes through the handle in the camera. But if you take away the handle, there's a different plug. It's a very specific plug, and there's no gear for this special plug. So if you take away the handle, you only have a camera with internal microphone. And timecode. And that's a lucky thing that Sony decided to put timecode in and out on the smaller cameras meanwhile as well. Because if you have any multi-camera setups or something like that, you can use timecode for coupling them, for example, on a multi-camera shoot or something like that. I'm not sure if you have any questions to audio, because I didn't want to cover audio in very detail with this, because this is probably the most interesting thing, to route the same signal to several channels, so you can dial in automatic on the one and manual mode on the other one and decide later which is the better sound. Yeah, I'm not sure. Is there any question for audio left? Okay, then let's see what else is there to. Do you see it again? Yeah, I have always to think if what's the combination of the signal sources here. This is where we stopped regarding focus. Speed and sensitivity. This is something I wanted to show. I'm not sure if I can present it just in one go, but I will have a try on this. First of all, I want to set the transition speed to fast and the subject sensitivity also to fast. You see on the top there are some examples when to use the different settings. For example, transition speed, if you use the autofocus to focus from one point to another and you want to have a nice smooth focus rack focus, you set it to a very slow setting and the focus will slowly move to the other position. Usually people want a fast autofocus. The second one is, for example, sports. One sport guy disappears, another one comes in, two different objects, and the camera is supposed to decide very fast on the new object. On the other hand, if you have, let's say, on the left side a dancing scene and you don't want the camera to lose the couple, then you switch the autofocus to a very locked on responsiveness to not lose the couple. And this is something I want to try to show. I'm not sure if I managed to really present this, but the first thing is I would switch to flexible spot, just to have a small spot area. I put it in the middle. And then we can try to focus to something else, from the face to something else. Let's try. So I have him, and I will try to focus to this, and focus back to him again, and it worked really fast. I'm not sure if you saw this, but this is 2.7 meters, as said on the left top. And I go to her and I go to this chart. This is 1.3, she is 1.6. And you see how fast the autofocus reacts. I'm not touching any buttons, I'm just moving the camera. Now let's switch to locked on. Locked on is the slowest setting for recognition things. I come from her, I go there. Is it focused? Oh, unfortunately, why? I don't know. Let's try again. It should not do this, but it does it. No? Oh. It's killing me. Ah, now it does. Okay, I switch it on and off again. I don't know. It's a computer. Okay, it will take. It will switch it off, switch it on. It works. Let's have it. Let's make an experiment. How long does it take until the focus sees the chart? So I'm moving the camera and just counting internally. 1. Now it makes. Yeah, yoo-hoo.
2 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, there it comes. If you do experiments different than me, it roughly takes 4 to 5 seconds. If you go to locked on, so 5 seconds, the camera doesn't look for different things. It stays on the same pane, and after 5 seconds, it takes the it takes the transition speed to focus to the new object. That's another method if somebody, for example, walks behind a tree. So you're talking to the camera is moving, a tree comes. Of course, you don't want to focus the tree, but probably the tree is 1 second, 2 seconds, and then the person is there again. So it's a good idea if you have one person and you want to stay with this person, put it on, I don't know, locked on or something in between. Perhaps instead of 5, you put it perhaps on 2 and make your own experiments. You can just roughly say locked on is 5 seconds, 5 seconds of delay. So that's the locked on thing. Yeah. Okay. That's it for autofocus for a moment. Or is there any question regarding autofocus? I think we covered a lot of things already.
If someone walks behind a tree, you could also choose for the face only.
Yeah, and then as long as it sees the face, it's, let's say, on 3 meters, and then the tree comes and he says, a tree is not a face, ping, then the face comes back. Sometimes, and this is the annoying part, some objects are recognized as a face. For example, in my studio, when my children were small, they draw to some paintings, and there were 1 or 2, people they drawed, and the camera sees a face. And sometimes you just move the camera to a chair, and suddenly there is some, I don't know, structure in the chair, and suddenly you see the face recognition. You say, oh, I'm focused to a chair, and the camera thinks it's a face. This is the reason why it's a good idea to know how fast, to have a fast autofocus off. With this lens, this is quite easy, because if you are in autofocus, you simply make, and that's it. Because this is switch off to manual mode, and then you have.
The little button in front.
Yeah, you can use a button on the front on some lenses. On some lenses you have the hold focus button. That is a user button in the menu, by the way. You can use it for anything. You can use the record on it if you like. And in other situations, you put it on a zoom grip. In other situations, you fastly have to know to switch the autofocus off, just in case, and switch it off completely. So it's a good idea to train that, yeah, if you to exercise and practice to go fast into autofocus and fast out of autofocus. Okay. Yeah, bitte.
Because you can also use, of course, touching the screen by aiming where you want to focus.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you're putting another screen on, it's not working anymore.
Well, most people that put another screen here move this screen, they dismantle it and put it, for example, on this side or on the back side.
You keep on working with that one, with focus.
Yeah, so for example, if you have a press conference and you have something big here for focusing, let's say, and you have still the small display on the back side, you can even use this as a, let's say, remote button. I wouldn't put the display completely away, because sometimes, let's pretend you switch to 4K 50p through SDI and suddenly your external monitor goes black because it's not capable of doing 4K, you're lost because you cannot switch it back. So it's always a good idea to have the display well near, or because it's really low weight as a remote screen somewhere, or put it to the side so somebody can watch it. And in just emergency, you can use it as a focus situation. Cable is quite long, so I saw even some gimbal like the Ronin 2. So the big gimbals where they use the display on the side, mounted to the side on the gimbal with the cable. It's roughly this long, so it's a little bit limited, of course. Just for looking at the picture, or in worst case, have somebody else touching a person or touching something, like a focus puller, touching on this button as well and helping you with autofocus. Okay, I think we have to leave the autofocus part again. Let's see what else do we have. Assign buttons. I think we should go through the assign buttons quickly because there are some surprises within the user buttons. Let's go there. By the way, I always see people, and I do it just for showing all the time here as well. I always see people going in menus and dialing back to the top again, scroll, hitting back, and then scroll, back, scroll. Please remember the button cancel because it's labeled back as well. And it's the fastest way to go out of some menus. You simply go back, and you are up there. I always see people scroll, back, oh, I missed it, scroll, back. I said, just hit the button back. It's going much faster. And if you have the joystick, it's going left, and you're out of the menu as well. But I do it for presentation. Otherwise, sometimes people see, oh, where's in the menu is so fast. Oh, where is he? So I do it the same way. Scroll, back, scroll. So let's go to user buttons again. There are 3 user areas again. Oh, sorry, you get it there as well. It's user button, user dial, or assign dial, and it's called multifunction dial. 3 categories. Of course, the buttons, button 1, 2, 3 on the side, 4, 5, 6 on the grip, 7, 8 on the top, and 9 on the side. And there's one more assign button, it's called focus hold button. So if there's a lens with the button focus hold, not all lenses have this, it's a user button in the camera. So you can use anything, you can do autofocus on it or whatever you like. What else? User buttons, user dials. It's a difference between the handle dial and the grip dial. The grip dial is second finger if you use the grip, second finger on this dial. In the past, this was iris, in general, iris. But for example, you said, I want to have f-stop 2, and I want to make the brightness brighter and darker, and why not using this for ND filter or for gain? So if you say, I don't want to change the iris, you can say this dial can be ISO, it can be ND filter, it can be iris, or it can be auto exposure shift, so give more or give less. In general, most people decide between these 3. If you like to control the iris, you put it to iris, and if you want to control the ISO, for example, you put it to ISO. And then you can dial in any iris value, and I'm changing the gain just with the dial in front. And if you know my limit is 5000 ISO, for example, you can use it. Yeah. So the iris, it's not only the iris that you can control with this button. There's a second wheel on the handle that you can use for ND or for iris as well. So you can decide if I carry the camera like this, do I use the ISO, for example, as well. And there's a third dial, that's the multifunction they call it, that's the menu dial. And the menu dial can do something as well. And I think you should always do this because in this lens, for example, there's no iris ring. And I'm not sure how to use the iris if there's no ring, so I have to do it with the menu. Okay, you can do it with the menu. Let's see. This is our standard picture. You press click in it, and now you have access to all the parameters, and there's the iris as well, and you can click it, and then you can close or open the iris. instead of clicking, it's a good idea to say, if you always use it this way, if the multifunction dial is on iris in general. That means you don't have to click, you just have to dial, and then the iris changes. Let's see if it hopefully works. Yeah, without clicking, this wheel is the iris wheel, and if I click, I can use anything else. Okay? Most people forget it, that this dial is a function dial that you can use, and most people forget about this, and it's a good idea. If you again say, I want to have f.2.8, you could put the ND filter on. ND, I'm not sure. Nee, ND, I think ND not, but what's the option? ISO or iris? Yeah. You can even use audio input level, because in former times, shoulder cameras had a volume dial down here, and so Sony decided with a lot of cameras to make the dial for the menu an audio dial as well. So you can even make the audio gain with it. I don't know anyone who does it, but it's possible. Okay, let's see what user functions are there. Let's go from top. It's quite a lot. I'm not explaining everything. I'm just going fast. If you have a question to one or two things, perhaps just remember it and ask afterwards. Otherwise, we don't get all the parameters, because it's a lot of user functions for 9 buttons. You know, it's 40 entrances or something like that for 9 buttons. In general, you can switch the base ISO, so the low and high mode, with a button. That's nice if you run from outside to inside. Who was it with the who said this in a break to me? Who was it who's changing ISO just by pressing? Yeah, it's a nice idea, because the press between low and high is 4 stops. It's probably the difference between inside and outside, roughly. Auto gain, auto ISO, you can switch it. You can push auto ISO. You can switch the ND filter with a button. You can push the auto ND filter, but this button is here on the camera itself. It's called ND auto. So I have no idea why they put the auto ND filter in the assign buttons as well. Perhaps to put it on the grip number 4, for example. Push auto ND is just the same function, just as long as you press the button. There's auto iris and push auto iris for changing the f-stop. Bokeh control, or the bokeh control, we already saw. It's just a combination of ND filter and iris, or ND filter and gain and iris working contrary for having a nice visual effect. Auto shutter, probably nobody really uses, because the problem with auto shutter is that it's stepping. If you go from a 50th of a second to a 100th of a second, the picture gets dark at 1 beat. And probably nobody knows it, and nobody uses it. Auto exposure setting, exposure settings in general, then you have the preset wide select. That could be a nice thing, because this is coming from shoulder cameras. Was it button number 1 I was editing? Yeah. If you're working on presets, let's switch the white balance to preset. There's a white balance button over the switch, and if you switch it, there's a selection of preset whites. So if people run into the street and say, I need 4300 Kelvin, you don't have to dial it in. You don't have to crit again. You simply can choose it from a list, and that's quite convenient. But there's a faster way to do it. If you switch the button number 1, it should switch between 3200 Kelvin, as you see on the left bottom, and you can switch the presets just in one go. So if you do a lot of run and gun and you say, now I'm in 4300, you just press the button, and you go into tungsten light and you press the button, and the preset changes. The other way to do it is hit enter, go to the value, click it, and just move it. Yeah.
Is there a limit to how many presets you can save?
In general, there's 2 presets, it's A and B. So you have a choice of 2 main presets that you can do. And the white preset from Sony is limited to the 4 standards, like 3.2, 4.3, 5.5, 6.5. And your own presets is A and B. It's 2 presets at least. Yeah. Sometimes it's enough for inside, outside, or outside in shadow, outside in sun, something like this. Or you have to dial it in. Perhaps this is a good point to talk about Kelvin numbers. if you try to match FX6 to FX9 to FX3, or alpha to FX6, alpha to FX9, and things like that, I always see absolute different values in white balance. And this made us really crazy, because in general you go to a multi-camera shoot and he has a Canon camera, I have a Sony camera, you have a different Sony camera, and we do a white balance on a white sheet of paper or on a gray card or whatever, and everybody does the same white balance on the same material. And perhaps you know this, 3 camera people, 3 cameras, 3 values. The first camera shows up 2,900, the second says 3,365, and the last camera says 3,6. And this was more than one time that I was so insecure in this situation that I said, he has 3,9, he's the boss, I dial in 3,9. And I'm messing up my white balance, because the white balance worked. If you're sure that you filled the screen with the white paper, and the others do the same white paper on the same light, they made a white balance, that probably worked. I made a white balance, that probably worked. And everybody is fighting against numbers. But by changing the white balance again, I'm messing up my white balance. The problem is that Sony and then all the other manufacturers don't have a measurement tool in the cameras for measuring a correct white balance. They just see, we need more blue, we need more red, and they try to calculate a general Kelvin number out of this. And this leads to different values. So if you, for example, we had a multi-camera shoot with Panasonic GH5, PDW 700 shoulder camera, FS7, FX6, and it was a total mess of numbers. And then we started, we go better to 4,300, and everybody was going to 4,300, making a different white balance in each camera. So don't get worried by different numbers if you have different models. Even if you have 2 different lenses, and this is something people forget, perhaps this lens is a little bit reddish and this lens is perhaps a little bit greenish, will give you 2 different Kelvin numbers. Though you have the same camera, the same light, the same object, and people get nervous and dial back to any values, and then you have to color correct material. So it's a good idea not to get confused by this, okay? Let's see what buttons we still have and what's expecting.
We have a production company here in the Netherlands that works with multiple FX9s.
Yeah.
And they found out that the preset system, so with the button, is the most correct way to match up multiple FX9s.
Yeah, okay, it's a good idea. Yeah.
They tried it out with different presets, but the button is
the button is the best one. Yeah. If you like to do white on the go, auto tracking white is the automatic white all the time. So you're moving the camera from shadow to sun, from sun to shadow. Some people don't like it because the camera does its own thing. But the nice thing is if you use a second button with ATW hold, that's the handbrake for it. So you're moving the camera at a certain point, you say, now the picture is nice, and then press the brake, ATW hold, because this fixes the preset at the moment of the situation. So for example, if you go from exhibitions or if you walk here, this is slightly tungsten, this is daylight, there's the aperture light doing some very bluish light, so probably we have a mixed light situation. And if I go with the camera into this, into that, the camera will probably move the RTV all the time, like bluish light, reddish light. If you use ATW, always use it with the second button, ATW hold, because if you find a situation where you say, now the camera moved to the right white balance, just stop it there and hold it. And if you go to exhibitions, for example, with different lights, that's a fantastic feature. You can follow a person, for example, going into bluish light. You see the bluish light changing in the camera, and you stop it at a certain point. It's like making a white balance on the go. We did a lot of teaching with this with shoulder cams like the Z750 for broadcast people, because they are very worried about ATW. And then we said, hey, let's have a try. And we made a tungsten light and a bluish area. And we said, now walk from left to right and follow the moderation or the people and try ATW. And we made it with a hold button just for training. And sometimes it's a good idea. After white balance, we have all the focus settings that we spoke about, like face detection on-off or focus setting. You remember focus setting? This was the dual parameter thing with switching zone, white, and spot. There are a lot of focus things more, but I don't talk about these ones. Focus magnifier is a nice thing, of course, for the display, making the display bigger for checking the focus. Slow and quick motion for slow and quick motion. Steady shot you don't need on a button, because this is steady shot on and off. If you want to set this, it's part of the display. If you go into the standard display and you move from parameters, there's a symbol for steady shot as well. Recording button, well, I have one on the camera. I have even two on the camera. I don't need the record button. But functions like picture cache recording, that's quite nice. This is the pre-recording of, let's say, 5 seconds or 10 seconds to the clip. So this is a nice function to have on a button if you sometimes want to switch it on and sometimes want to switch it off. Record review is playback of the last clip or the last few seconds. If you do a lot of talking heads and somebody wants to listen to the material, or you want to listen to the material, instead of going thumbnails, check the thumbnail, play, you can use this function for playing back the last clip or the last 10 seconds. Sometimes it's really nice to have a fast playback. If you do filmic work, motion picture, you remember perhaps these 3 settings. That's the copy setting in former times of film material, like saying a clip is okay, will be copied, or a clip is not good, negative, not good, NG, or this is a clip that perhaps can be used, so you can give a clip metadata, and if an editor or a cutter has approach to it, he can simply take clips that you signed as good. I must admit, I'm using this a lot if we're doing industry movies, industry film, because then you have something from public relations or marketing, and you're filming, let's say, a machine, and you don't know exactly what this machine is about, and you do one clip after another, one take after another, and suddenly the marketing people say, have you seen? This was the moment when the machine did blah, blah, blah. This was perfect. And you said, it was like all the other clips. And then you go into the thumbnails and say, clip marker, okay. You can even do it afterwards, after filming. So you stop the clip, press the clip flag, and it will be marked. I can show it because it's really nice. I really like it. It was button run, right? I'm not sure, because the features from camera to camera differ regarding the remote. I know the FS7, with the FS7 you can do it because you have the user buttons on the remote, and you can say, I press the user button 1 on the remote, and then it works. I'm not sure with the FX6, I don't think so. Let's pretend you're shooting a clip, it's recording, and you shot the clip, and at a certain point you stop it and you say, this was perfect, and afterwards you press 1. And it says, I mark this clip as okay, even after the recording. You can do it while the recording, you can do it after the recording, but you cannot do it if you're playing back, because then after playback, the camera doesn't know exactly which clip was playbacked. So this is marked, and if you look on the thumbnails, you will find a nice, friendly OK sign for the good clip, or NG for the bad clips. And if you have, for example, a software that can interpret this, or go into Catalyst Browse, you can see the markers and have a selection of copies that you of clips that you copy, for example. Sometimes it's a nice idea to have something like this. Okay, this was the OK flag. So also you can say clip is not good, NG, or clip is okay, yeah, let's keep it. Then you can set up some color bars and the tally light in front. If you do investigative recordings, you can switch on and off the tally light in front with a button. Sometimes it's nice to have this as well. Of course, you can do it in the menu, but then you have to go into the menu. Time code display, we can leave this. What's interesting, viewfinder mode switches to black and white. there are still some camera people that say they can focus better on black and white pictures. Perhaps because they're used to black and white viewfinders from the past. I don't know exactly. You can put it on the button. Peaking on off, zebra on off, volume for playback, thumbnail, well, there's a thumbnail button on the camera. Touch operation on off. I think you usually don't switch off the touch screen. Otherwise you do it in the menu. You can switch on and off the handle zoom. There are some upload things. And now this is interesting because this is entering the new topic, proxy recordings. I'm not sure if you're familiar with proxy, but as you see in this writing, it's called auto upload proxy. Let's talk about proxy for a moment first, just a moment. Proxy workflow. Everything started, I think, with the PDW 700 shoulder cam, because each HD recording had a small companion, a small recorded clips in very low resolution. And these clips, you could take these clips on a USB stick and review it. So the idea behind it was, I'm shooting the high-res stuff, and I give you the material, and you can already review it. And so with little preview files. And this is what happens in the camera today. If you're shooting 4K or HD, there's a companion in, if you like, HD that is recorded parallel. Unfortunately, and that's the difference between FX9 and FX6, for example, the FX9 has a dedicated slot for this. There's a dedicated second slot for SD cards that only collect proxy files. So you can take out the SD card, give it to somebody, and you're still shooting, and you take high-res with you. And this camera, there is no additional SD card slot. So everything is on one card. And if you want to hand out proxy files, you have to put it in a computer and take the proxy files and give them. So you have to divide it yourself. If you want to see the quality of proxy files, we did shoot some of or some material already with proxy files yesterday. This is not yesterday, but this is a proxy file. This was shot at a grading in a grading suite, and this is HD quality of the proxy file. And to be honest, it's quite good. It's so good that the WDR found that they can broadcast proxy files in the Tagesschau. So in the main news format, I was involved in it a little bit because I did the camera trainings in Münster and in other WDR facilities. And just for fun, they made proxy recording and upload on FTP servers. Because the radio people said, "Herr Mors, how good is the sound of a proxy file?" I said, "I have no idea. Should be MP3 quality, something like that." And they say, "Can we have a recording?" I said, "Yeah, I can do a test recording. I give it to you." And they took the proxy files and went in their audio suite and started editing the audio of the proxy file. And then they said, "Is it possible to upload from the camera on the field to our server?" I said, "Yes, you can take any smartphone or any mobile hotspot device, go wireless by Wi-Fi to the camera, and the camera itself can upload on their own proxy files. So you can switch on auto upload. That's the reason why there's a button auto upload. As long as you start, stop, the camera starts uploading the clips, even while you're shooting. And the radio people in Münster, they were totally impressed by that and said, "Could you please switch on auto upload all the time and have a small hotspot with you? Because if you're shooting interviews, news, we can edit the radio news already while you are shooting." And they started to do that in Münster alone, just Münster. And then the social media people looked the radio people over the shoulder and said, "What is that?" And then they said, "It's some footage coming in." And they said, "Can we have it for social media?" "Yes, of course, it's on the server." And they started doing social media news with it. And then unfortunately, a very sad happening happened 2.5 years ago. In Münster, there was an amok run. And 2 camera teams tried to interview witnesses. And the Tagesschau called Münster and asked for footage. And the guy in Münster said, "We don't have footage, they're still on the way, but we have proxy files. You can review them." And the Tagesschau looked onto the server and found all the proxy files coming in. And they said, this is not live view, this is not live view, Rucksack. What is it? And then Münster said, it's the camera. The camera itself loads it up to the FTP server. And they took this and sent and broadcasted it. And afterwards, my phone rang, and there was the Tagesschau calling me and saying, did you do the camera trainings in Münster? I said, yes, I did the whole WDR camera training. And they said, did you tell them how to work with proxy files? And I said, oh my God, what they want from me? Yes. The whole WDR needs a manual how to do it. And so we widened this up to all the WDR stations. Everybody has a hotspot on the camera, so you can just touch it like the small URVs, just taped to the camera. And now the cameras load up if you like. Of course, you don't like every clip to be uploaded. I must admit, I'm the probably worst clip waster of all times. Sometimes I forget to switch off the camera, so it's running and running and running, and it's absolutely worse if you upload this clip. If it's 10 minutes long in the back and you start uploading clips, or sometimes I tell things that shouldn't be in the edit. It's a better idea to upload them, or if you have all the takes, dozens of takes of one talk, and you upload every take. So one way is to auto-upload, so the camera loads up all the time. The second way is you go into the thumbnails. Please let me go into the thumbnails. And you can even upload proxy files from there. Or you connect, and that's the main thing probably. I don't have the iPad here. No. You connect an iPad or your smartphone to the camera and look onto the thumbnails even while the camera is recording, and select proxy files that you want to upload. And the camera loads it up. Thank you very much. Because there's one application, perhaps you heard about it, it's called Content Browser Mobile. And if you hook up a smartphone or, just a moment, give me a second, smartphone or an iPad to the camera, you will have the live picture of the camera. In this case, the menu. Of course, I don't want to have the menu. I don't want to have the smart things. Too many buttons.
This is not the Imaging Edge application.
Imaging Edge is alpha and alike, and Content Browser Mobile is FX6, FX9, and shoulder cams.
The Edge is what happens to be.
It's called Content Browser Mobile, CBM. You find it in Apple Store and in the Google Store. It's free. And you have to make a connection by Wi-Fi. So you can ask the camera to make a Wi-Fi and connect it to the iPad. In this case, the camera is hooked up to the Vocas Wi-Fi, and this is hooked up to the Vocas Wi-Fi as well. That's a funny thing, because you can walk around the whole facility with this iPad and see the camera picture. And the worst button on this application is down there. It's called Record. And what's the contrast of record? Stop. So if you press it the right way, if you hand out the live picture, if you switch it to live picture and hand out to somebody, take care that they don't put the stop button, that they don't press it, or lock the screen with the small lock on top. But there's no password for it or something like that, so everybody can unlock it again who knows how to press it. I asked the Sony people, please, can you do the same app without a record button, without remote things? Because you can also dial in the iris, for example. We can change ISO values, let's say 20,000, for example. I'm not sure. Yeah, it switched to 20,000, but the ND filter goes against it. So you can do a lot of remote things, because this was intended to be a camera person app. If you place the camera as a B camera somewhere and you want to hit record, or you see the focus isn't right, this is just a very easy preview window. So this is low resolution wireless, so don't expect this to be HD or 4K or something like that. But this is not the stream from the camera. The camera still has another stream. So you can, this is just a remote app stream, absolutely separate from proxy files and from the rest of the processing in the camera. So the nice thing is, if you want to see proxy files, just give me a second. Next time we hook it up to the monitor, then you have the proxy files. And if you want to play one or two clips back, does it do it? Yeah, that's the recording that we did before, and I can even hit the record button and do something else with the camera. So actually, this is really nice if you do some reviews of the footage. You can download the footage to the iPad for reviewing later. And you can select clips that has to be uploaded. And it's not the iPad uploading the clips, it's the camera uploading the clips through LTE or through Wi-Fi or whatever. Of course, I can download the clips to here and download it then from here. So there are a lot of, let's say, workflows that you can follow with this app, especially with proxy files. So I really would recommend you to see what proxy files can do. You will find the proxy files, if you're not recording, in the camera menu. So we go to the camera menu and scroll down a little bit. And no, it's not in the camera menu, it's in the system menu, in the next menu, sorry. And there you can switch it on. And there's only an on and off in the FX6. In the FX9 you have complete choice of different formats, from HD to very low res preview files. Yeah.
And when, let's say when you're filming, because we are traveling a lot, and can you also use it as some sort of backup, the proxy files?
Some sort of what?
Yeah, backup. Because,
Yeah.
Let's say the parts get lost, you always have the proxy file?
Yeah, well, you know, in this case, it's on the same memory card. So actually, if the memory card has a problem, probably both have a problem.
No, it's just that
But in general, yes.
you have to bring back the
Yeah.
parts. So let's say, I don't know, something
Yeah.
that's wrong, and you already have uploaded the proxy files.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Then they have already.
Yeah. You have a backup on the FTP server, for example. This is something they encountered in Münster, for example, as well, because after 2 weeks, somebody was complaining that the FTP server gets fuller and fuller on this folder. And then they said, okay, we must erase it after a while. And they decided to have a 3-day automatic eraser. So you have 3 days time to take this footage, or otherwise it will be deleted, the proxy files. You can even upload high-res files, but you cannot shoot at the same time. So it's possible to upload high-res files, but to be honest, for example, this file here, how big is it? This was, I'm not sure, do you still see it? Yes. 100 megabytes, and that's a typical size of a several minute proxy file. So usually, if the high-res recording is something like 80 megabytes or 800 megabytes, the proxy file is much smaller, because the bit rate of these proxy files is roughly 8 megabit per second. Roughly 1 megabyte per second. And then you can calculate, you know, 1 minute of recording is 60 megabytes or something like that.
About sound quality, how was the sound quality?
It's like a good MP3. I would compare to 224 MP3 or something like that. To be honest, you don't hear any artifacts like in the past with the shoulder cams. When you played back the small proxy files from a PDW 700, it was 8 kilohertz sampling rate. It was something like this. That's not a comparison at all anymore. So it's a good thing. The only limit you see on the screen, you have to decide between channel 1 and 2 or 3 and 4, because proxy files are 2 channel only. That's sometimes bad if you use, let's say, an FX9 with a slot-in receiver, and you have your main microphone on channel 3, let's say, and Atmo on channel 1 and 2. And then you have to decide, do I give the Atmo, so the background, on the proxy file? Probably not. I will give the wireless, so channel 3 and 4, on the proxy file. But what happens if the guy switches off the microphone? There's no audio at all. Because as long as there is 3 and 4, it will never record channel 1 and 2. And perhaps 1 and 2 is, when I switch this off, the only sound that it's on the recording. You have to think a little bit how you make your setup. Many people have channel 1 as the wireless or the hand microphone, and channel 2 is Atmo mic or the background microphone. Some other do stereo and do it different. So you must find your way through this. The funny thing is, if you do this, it's possible to take these proxy files, for example, in Resolve, as proxy files. So you start editing on these files and you bring in high-res files later, absolutely later. Or you switch between 4K and proxy. When we did multi-camera shootings with FX6 and FX9, I asked everybody to switch on proxy files, and we loaded the proxy files in at first, did multi-camera editing, and replaced this by the 4K material, because my laptops don't play 4 cameras or 5 cameras 4K. And so we just worked on proxy files. Adobe Premiere is a little bit difficult because Premiere doesn't like 2-channel audio in this case. Premiere, if you put in the main files, these are 4-channel audio, or here it's 4-channel audio. And if you want to replace proxy with 2-channel, Premiere is asking, this doesn't fit. You know, it's a different file system than before. But you can have a workaround. If you convert these files into 4-channel with any tool, and say Premiere, here are 4-channel proxy files, then it will take it. So it's the main thing is the name. Again?
You can do it in Premiere.
Meanwhile, it works? The better.
Modify interpreted footage and
Okay.
channels.
See, I'm working with older. Well, yeah, perfect. Now it works. Yeah.
For recording the proxy files, you can't make any choices. Can you say put the regular footage of disc 1 and...
No. It's unfortunately going to one card, and this is. I know that Sony wanted to do it in the past, but for any reason they cannot do it, or don't do it, or perhaps they don't want to mess it up for any reason. It's going to one card, but to be honest, just take a very simple, stupid laptop, something that has a reader for SD cards or for these compact flash cards, because the proxy files are collected in a folder. So it's the so-called subfolder, and in the subfolder there are only proxy files. So you can take the subfolder, copy it, and usually it's a few hundred megabytes, and it's a fast way of copying this. Could be a method. Okay, if you go high-res and proxy recording, you have different choices to work with it. First of all, of course, you can copy it on a laptop and give it away. Then you can upload it to FTP from the camera. That's very nice. You can preview it in the app, as we showed in the small CBM app. You can use it in Resolve or Premiere as editing alternative. Or simply, copy it or just watch it or whatever. And even the Content Browser Mobile is able to show the timecode. Because if you take a proxy file into QuickTime Player, the QuickTime Player says, it's starting with 0 seconds, because many computer players don't know how to interpret timecode. If it's important to view or review proxy files with timecode, simply put these proxy files, MP4, into Catalyst Browse. Because Catalyst Browse will see the timecode, it will see the audio channels, it will see metadata, and then you have the correct timecode. For example, the clip that we just saw a second ago, if I put this in Catalyst Browse, then you will see it doesn't start at 0 seconds, but with a dedicated timecode. Takes a while. There it is. And there you see it was recorded at 4 p.m. And this is timecode. And you can even start to grade with it. And if it's S-Log, for example, you could start working with it as a reproduction of the high-res clip. So far? Yeah. I think that's enough for the first step regarding proxy files. Let's see what we still have. I'm not sure how interested you are in S-Log and lookup tables, because this is quite a special topic. In general, shooting S-Log means you're shooting 14 stops of light of your scene and save it into the recording, and you decide afterwards to have the picture developed. Like I bring down the exposure afterwards, I make the white balance completely different, I raise up some dark parts or whatever. And you can also use S-Log for changing to different looks. For example, I'm not sure if you remember my UPS driver, because I'm using this for years, because somebody shot in a workshop. We had 7 FS7s, and we went outside, and just funnily the UPS driver came by, and I said, everybody gonna shoot the UPS driver, and everybody was filming him. And this was the situation when this clip was happening. Let me show this again and explain something. I will give you the clip again. You remember the bad situation when the driver crossed the light? This is because S-Log was recorded, is translated into Rec 709. Rec 709 was invented with interlaced TV. So Rec 709 is a follow-up by Rec 601 SD. And then the CRT, so the HD recordings, were played back on interlaced televisions, on tube televisions, and this was when Rec 709 was introduced. So actually Rec 709 is quite old, is still on interlaced tube TVs, was developed, and probably it's a good idea to get rid of it. What happens if I switch it off and put another curve on it? And the curve is called S709. That's S-Cinetone as a lookup table. It's not 100% the same because Sony says if you want to grade, if you want to go into grading, use this lookup table and it will preserve highlight and it will preserve, careful, shadows. And some people say the shadows are not contrasty enough to broadcast this straight away. So if you take this lookup table, usually most people push the blacks a little bit, make it a little bit contrasty. On the first glance, it looks the same. It's a little bit difficult with this monitor because this monitor tends to burn out a little bit early. I tried to fix it this morning, but I didn't get it. But perhaps you see S709 in a difference. I'm not sure if you can judge it on this monitor, but this situation was much worse on Rec 709. It still doesn't look good on this one, but if you see it on the Apple screen, there's still structure. You can even read, if you can go later, you can even read the address. So there's so much structure in it. Probably this is just, I'm going through the atom mixer there. It's got lost on the way. That means if you want to shoot S-Log, you have the decision of going into Rec 709, have a film look on top, just a straight film look that is forgiving in a lot of situations, or if you want to grade it manually, because some people want to, put their hands on the S-Log material and start from scratch. But it's not. I think sometimes it's not necessary because you have so many options, even in this software. This was the situation in S-Cinetone. Just be careful. There's more structure to it than you see, and this was Rec 709 before. And you still have the choice. And this is not about being a colorist and a grading artist. It's just about taking the right lookup table and put it on top. And that's it. Lookup table possibilities in these cameras are quite complex. Perhaps one more thing. If you go to the menus, you will find something called paint and look. Paint is usually the way of taking parameters and changing colors, so you can change a lot of colors in the camera. And the look is something special. You will find a so-called scene file and a base look, and if you go into the base look, that's the main decision, what's the camera look like. For example, if you start the camera, it's working in color space Rec 709, but it has Sony's film look, or S-Cinetone, as a look. And you can change this look to Rec 709, then you have a punchy, saturated, old-fashioned, old TV style look as well. And there are some, recipes in between. I must admit, it's just because it's just there. Most people decide S-Cinetone as a film look or Rec 709 as the old-fashioned look. For example, if you combine, let's say, the FX6 to a shoulder cam. The shoulder cam is Rec 709, it's punchy, contrasty. It's a good idea to switch the FX6 to the same level just for having a similar picture. But if you go further, you will find lookup table slots. You can load lookup table slots for your general recording. So if there's somebody giving you the ultimate ARRI Alexa film look, and you say, usually I can only use it when I shoot S-Log and we can put it on later, you can put it on now into the standard recording, doing white balance, doing contrast settings in the camera, and you can use a lookup table as a look. And that's a funny thing. If you have a collection of film looks, for example, and you put it into the camera and say, this is the look I want to shoot. Or if you have a colorist, a friend of you, and you make a test shoot, let's say in this area, and you want to have a very dedicated look, you go with this test shoot to the color station, to the color grading. He makes a little bit of grading, gives you the lookup table, you come back to the camera and put it in the camera and record with this look. So you don't, you make an in-camera grading, let's say. And all the parameters that are within the camera, like the color settings, like the black settings for making more contrast, setting the detail, so the focus, how detailed is the picture, or all the camera color settings like blue and magenta and all these other colors in the color wheel can be set independently. So that means, for example, if this red, if we make an image movie for Sachtler and they say, oh, this red looks a little bit orange, can you change it? Usually you say, I can change it in post-production. Now you can say, I will find the right red level for it. Probably it's R like red. Perhaps it's a little bit magenta-ish red. This would be the right color. Or is it more yellowish red? Then this is the color. And then you can decide the color tone and the saturation for it. And you can do it 16 times through the whole color circle. So even matching a camera to another one with this is much easier, and you have the lookup table on top. So there are different ways of tuning the camera. So you can even match it to, let's say, a Canon camera or Panasonic camera if you have the right tools for it. And usually the right tool to match cameras is this chart or the newest versions of this because this is called Chroma du Monde, Colors of the World, because this is the complete color wheel from red to magenta to blue to cyan to green to yellow and back. And you can calibrate cameras with this. And if you have two cameras, like the FX3 and the FX6, FX3 has not a lot of parameters to change, but the FX6 has. You can make a matching to other cameras. Or if we have, let's say, a Canon camera, and I'm shooting this chart, I can make an FX6 setting that matches to the Canon camera, for example. There was one question here, I don't know. Somebody in the front first? No? It's gone? Ah, okay, you.
And you record the Cineton, but can you see on viewfinder the 709 look?
No. It's one look that you decide. If you go to a Cinetone, you see it everywhere. Yeah?
So you see it before grading?
Yeah, as Cinetone in general, as we shoot now, is what you see is what you get. So it's burnt in your recording, and the camera becomes, let's say, a Cinetone camera.
That's not a lock no.
It's a kind of look or lookup table, but it's working while you're recording. Yeah, it's going into the recording. It's burnt into the recording. The other way is you shoot S-Log, and you see S-Cinetone as a lookup table just for the viewfinder, but you're recording S-Log for post-production. But you can divide it now, because in former times people said, we would like to have a film look, but we don't want to go into post-production. We want the film look, but not in post-production. And this is the reason why, for example, Arri sells the Arri Amira, because the Amira can also burn in the look, and you have the Arri look in the footage. And Sony could do it in the past, but there were a lot of limitations, and you didn't have the color parameters. And now you would say a Cinetone is Sony's film look. And the question is, do I want to go in post-production with it and do it afterwards? So you shoot S-Log, but you see a Cinetone. Or do I switch the camera to a Cinetone internally and record a Cinetone and just hand it to the next person? And that's what you see is what you get. If you overblast a Cinetone, it's overblasted. If you make the color greenish in the color setting, the Cinetone is greenish. Yeah? Okay, that's nice thing about this. Okay, perhaps the last topics that we start in. Let's see what's there. Ah, that's interesting. Do you still see the picture? Yeah. No, you don't. I need this other one. If you shoot FX3, FX6, FX9, we found that these three cameras still have a different look. You can tune the looks to match it better. But this is what happens if you shoot S-Log with all 3 cameras and use one lookup table. So this is 3 times recording picture in picture. The outer part is the FX3, and the FX3 has very few parameters to change the picture. It's just saturation and something like that. The middle part is FX6, and the inner part is FX9. So from outside to inside, FX3, FX6, FX9. And this was a complete S-Log recording onto this chart. And we didn't change anything, we just put a lookup table on top. And of course there are some colors not matching perfectly, like the red. So in the middle, red, but all other cameras are quite similar, and I think to fix this red is not that easy, because on the FX3 the red is a little bit orange, and on FX6 and FX9 it matches better. It's a little bit magenta-ish, but I would say it's quite easy to match that. And this is different to the internal recording. When we set a reset on 3 cameras, FX9, FX6, FX3, without shooting S-Log, making white balance, it's really important to make a good white balance if you want to match cameras. We've really found that makes a huge difference if you're on the right white balance. White balancing all the 3 cameras to one object. Then we shot S-Log and just put a lookup table on all 3 of them without doing any grading, and this was the result. And I must admit, I was quite happy when I saw this, because the standard recording did not fit this well. And if I say, okay, red is the only, unfortunately red, is the only color that didn't fit 100 perfect, but in Resolve or Premiere it's very easy to hit this red and put it a little bit back to orange or to magenta, and just move it a little bit. And you can do it in the FX6, you could do it with this parameter, with the R parameter, and simply move it somewhere else. If you want to see what happens with this, just very, very, very simple. Just to see what the camera does if you move something like that. First of all, I give you Rec 709 for punchy colors. This is in the, well, let's say base look. Select Rec 709 for punchy colors. Then you have to look for the chart. Of course, it's better to make, that's too glossy. Let's try this way. I just need the color, otherwise I must take you as a color. There are some colors. Okay, this is not a zoom lens, of course, and I have to take this away. Okay. Take out the ND filter. Again? Yeah. Okay, this is not scientific at all, of course, but it's just about seeing some colors. Okay, you see the chart itself. I can open up the iris a little bit, perhaps there. And if you go into the matrix, and this is something you can really try yourself, use the multi-matrix. You just have to remember this name, because matrix, the parameter on top, is a very scientific thing. Multi-matrix is a very user-friendly thing. If you go to multi-matrix, you will find, you switch it on, of course, and then you find a whole bunch of colors, starting on the top with blue. That's the selection for the blue color. From blue to blue plus, that's going into magenta, from magenta into red, so we are walking counterclockwise, right? From blue into magenta, into red, into yellow, we're walking this way around through the parameters. And if you find one parameter, like let's say red, you can set the color tone for this red channel. For example, making the red, I try to over saturate it. The red changes into magenta or into orange. And you can also set the saturation for this color. For example, I take out the saturation completely and making red black and white. And if you start on all the colors, if you, for example, have a red product, or if you have a person that's a little bit too reddish, you could imagine it's just a proposal. You can make a person that is very reddish in the face. You can go to the red channel and take out a little bit of saturation. That's a kind of in-camera color grading. Or if you have a product, let's say this green adding, perhaps this green is too yellowish in the picture. Or this camera sees it as a dark green and my camera sees it as a bright green. I could go into this parameter and try to play with saturation and the color tone. And that means on top of the lookup table, you can change colors even with a lookup table. Of course, I can go into grading and do it afterwards or make a lookup table for it, but I can also take this and move the parameters. And we did this in a Sony session. We made a 1.5 training for color matching cameras, and we took exactly FX3, FX6, FX9 because we were a little bit surprised that they don't match in the standard setting. And we took these cameras and we made a webinar measuring it against this chart, and we started, taking the FX9 and making the green a little bit this way, and the yellow this way, and the magenta this way, until it matched the FX3. And then we took the FX6 and did exactly the same, matching this. It's possible. Probably it's nothing you want to do while run and gun shooting. But sometimes if you combine your recordings with a colleague, and a colleague comes, for example, with a Blackmagic camera or Canon camera, and you don't have the same picture, it might be worth to take interview lights in the preparation, make 2 times the same picture and compare it on a screen and start tuning a little bit and save a Blackmagic setting, for example, in the FX6. You can save it on a SD card. If you want to save it to an SD card or a compact flash card, slot B is the only slot that takes presets, settings, etc. So you cannot deliberately go to card 1 or card 2. Card 2 is the main card for example, lookup tables. So always remember, if you want to load in lookup tables, usually you put it in slot A, and then you start load lookup table. No lookup tables, no card, strange. Slot B is the setting, the setting card system.
Could you use it for green screen? To make your screen?
You can make green greener by saturating. Yes, of course. That's an old trick we did in the digital beta times as well. Just push the green into the right slot, to the right position, and make it more saturated. Absolutely. Same.
Are the base settings all set to 0? Or?
Yeah, you can reset them. So they are all on 0. All colors are standard. And then you have to, unfortunately, you have to find which green is the right green. Other cameras can show it, like the FS7. There's a zebra pattern that shows the color you're working on. Unfortunately, it doesn't work in this way on this camera. So you have a little bit try. Perhaps it's the green channel. I don't know. I have a try. I will just move the color somewhere else, and we have a look on it. Does it happen somewhere? Probably not so much. So you have to take another green. If you want to see it exactly, it's a good idea to take an Atomos or a small HD monitor and have a vector scope hooked up to it. I will do it in a moment as well, just for seeing it, because sometimes it's a good idea to see what's going on, right? So this is a vector scope. Of course, as long as you are in the menu, it looks a bit weird. Let's do it with the red channel again, just for showing. Yeah. So if I move the red channel, you will see that there happens a lot of things. This red is moving to the right or to the left, and each point is one color on the color chart. And of course, there's a lot of carpet. Okay, the waveform is a representation of the color wheel. These colors, RGB, etc., are colors of the color wheel, and you're moving all the small colors to different places. If you say I do less saturation in red, these points go into the middle. They slot into the middle, and the middle is low saturation, out is high saturation. If you're interested in this in any kind more, just speak to me or send me an email, because this is quite interesting when you're matching cameras. If you have a friend with a Canon C300, for example, and there's a Canon look in the camera, and you want to fake it or you want to get closer to it, First of all, you can make a lookup table that does the work. Second, you can do the matrix settings and try to tune the camera into this. Yeah. Questions for this? No? Okay. So what else? I'm not sure if we have something else. We roughly hit the 2 o'clock mark. Some minutes to go. If you have any last questions. Otherwise, I would do with the rest of you the FX9, FX6 discussion. We can do it officially if you like, if you're interested. Otherwise, huh?
I would like to record that as well.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I try to make it short. Yeah.
If you switch to S&Q,
Yeah.
your shutters changes.
Yes.
Is there a way to avoid that? Because I also get putting it back when you're actually...
Yeah, you know, that's a big drawback at Sony in general, because in the moment you switch to slow motion, like 120 frames, of course the shutter must go with it. And unfortunately, Sony doesn't save the old value somewhere. Perhaps they are technically not, it's perhaps not possible. They don't remember the last setting. Sometimes I see this as an approach to practice. With the FS7, for example, I did the following. I was always, no, let's start different. You're shooting outside and you have ND2. And now you go to slow motion, and slow motion switches, of course, the shutter to the frame rate, and suddenly the picture is darker. So you have to go away in the ND filter, you have to adjust the iris, you have to do a lot of things to shoot slow motion. And when you're done, you have to rework everything. You have to dial in the ND filter, go back to the shutter, etc. And what I did in the past is I just looked, what setting do I need for slow motion? And then I dialed in exactly the same settings before I went into slow motion. For example, we're standing in a station, in a train station, and there was a steam locomotive coming in. And everybody said, the steam locomotive will come in 10 minutes. And then I say, okay, this is the position where we want to film it. And then I switch to slow motion, and I see, okay, I have to take out the ND filter, I have to take shutter speed at blah, 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 etc. And then I left it as it is, and went out of slow motion, and I left the ND filter like it was, I left the shutter speed like it was, and tried to arrange with the iris against it. So I know exactly when the steam machine comes, I just have to press slow motion mode, because it's exactly the same exposure. And sometimes I have the impression that Sony had a work like this in mind, like jumping forth and back from slow motion. As long as you have the same shutter speed, you have the same exposure, right? But of course, if you say, okay, my time slow motion was 500ths of a second, now I want to shoot 50ths of a second, of course you have to dial in everything again, like ND filters, because they don't remember their settings.
Unless you use shutter anyway.
Yeah, that's right. But I would support you. Sometimes it's really stupid that you cannot jump forth and back between slow motion and normal shooting. It's just the way it is, yeah. And this is, so if you hit slow motion, I took slow motion unfortunately out of the button, but I will do it back on a button again so that we can talk about it. Let's say button 1 is usually the slow motion button. It's probably somewhere on the top, there. So if you hit the slow motion button one time, it's just starting the slow motion system. Slow motion doesn't record audio, because how do you want to put audio with 40 frames on a timeline with 25 frames? Sony never did record audio in slow motion, unfortunately, so you have to make your own audio afterwards or record with the iPhone or whatever. If you press the button a long time, you can set up the frame rate. And this is, in my case, 100 frames per second, because I'm in full frame 4K, and you see there's a little, you cannot shoot in full frame. There's a little, how do you say, a little crop if you do 100 frames per second 4K full frame, because Sony is not fast enough to take all the pixels. So it's cropping in a little bit. That's just the sign for it, cropping in a little bit, but the framing is roughly the same. In HD, you can go higher in the frame rate. And now, as you said, it's a problem. The picture is darker, and I have to relight it or reset it. Let's see, I have ISO 400, 120th of a second. Would you stay with 120 of a second with filming 100 frames? The problem is if somebody is, double. Yeah, if somebody is moving, usually you shoot 25p with 50th of a second. Or 50i, most people shoot 50i with 50th of a second due to noise, etc. So I would like to have the double shutter speed, or half the shutter speed, to be honest, against the frame rate. So you can select this and go to, let's say, 240. 250 is the next step, and you see how dark the picture gets. And now we can think, what about the ISO? Let's see. How bright must the ISO be? Probably this is too bright. Let's go back somewhere here. And now I'm on ISO 2500. Would you take low ISO sensitivity or high sensitivity in this case? Who's for low? Who's for high? High is wrong. Why? You need 2500 ISO to make at least this picture. It's not wrong as long as you go with ND filter against it. If you go with ND, it's fine. If you stay on this.
That's what it's there for.
Yeah. So this was a kind of gap. Yeah, you're right in both kinds of. Actually, if I switch to high ISO, I cannot drop to 2500. You have to shoot on 5000 ISO and get rid of the light somewhere else. So, for example, on the shutter. So actually, you're right as well, kind of. The low people are kind of right because it's easy for me to go to 2500 in low mode, and 2500 is probably not that bad, but it's a plus in gain. We're coming from 800 and we go in plus in gain, and perhaps it's a bad idea.
So this is probably more grainy than...
Yeah, it's probably a little bit more grainy, yeah, exactly. But if we return, let's pretend we can do it. So I go to page number 2, for example, and there is high and low sensitivity. I go to high. Wow, that's much too gainy. And I go back to the lowest setting, that was 5000. Now we can think of ND filters. We can think of shutter. Shutter speed is not bad because slow motions usually look better if you have a short shutter speed. So I would do it with shutter speed. So I can double or half time the shutter speed, and that should be the same picture, right? The advantage is, yes, this is quite noise-free because 12,800 is our start, and we go into minus dB, minus ISO. That's better than in the low setting. On the other hand, if you drop out of slow motion now, let's see what happens then. What do you expect now? If I drop out of slow motion, will the picture be brighter? Way brighter. Who is for brighter? Who is for the same? Who is for lower? You were thinking of the same.
Because the shutter speed doesn't change.
Let's have a try. I switch it off. Yeah, the only thing that changes is the crop is gone, the little slow motion crop. Because, and this is, you said it's a kind of drawback. The shutter speed stays the same, the ISO is the same, the lens is the same. So the brightness of the picture didn't change. And the advantage is I can go on shooting, of course, with the 1/500th of a second. That's perhaps not that great, but remember my locomotive coming in. People are waiting, people are nervous, the train is coming, and you can set the camera already to 500, 5000, whatever. You know, I just have to press slow motion and the exposure is right. Yeah? Slow motion, exposure is right. Out of slow motion, exposure is right too. I can film some faces, some children, something, blah, blah, and somebody's calling, there's the locomotive coming! And you just press slow motion and press record. That's an advantage in this case. But of course, if you are focused on 50,
if you change up and down between slow motion
yeah,
on and off, you would keep a high speed, a high shutter.
No. As long as you don't move the camera for sports or something like that. But filming people, filming faces, filming some close-ups or some wide shots, and then drop into slow motion, make the slow motion, drop out of slow motion, start filming people again. This is an advantage in this case, and I must admit, I guess that Sony does that for this reason. But of course, you're right. If you want to change back to 50th of a second, you start pushing shutter and you go to 50th of a second. Now it's too bright, and then you have to ND filter and blah, blah, blah.
If you could demonstrate it with the shutter angle as well, just to keep it
Yeah, okay. Yeah, the people that like shutter angle, they are a little bit, how do you, sorry, I must go into the menu for this, just a moment. It's time for ending showing menus, I guess. Let's go into the camera menu, go into shutter, and you can change the writing, let's say, of the shutter from time, like 1/50th of a second, to shutter angle. That's still, shutter angle is still connected to the frame rate. So if you make a shutter angle of, let's say, 180 degrees, that means you make a circle in half. That was a physical unit in film cameras, dividing the time for exposure to half, independent of the frame rate. So if you do 50th of a second, the shutter is, if you do 50 frames, the shutter 180 degrees is, what was it? 100th. If you do 25p, the shutter is 1/50th, because it's always cut in half with 180 degrees. So let's change. Did I switch it to shutter to the right position? No, I didn't. Angle, and the angle is, let's say, 180 degrees. That means if I'm shooting at the moment 25p, time is by half. It's a 50th of a second. If I do slow motion, it will be cut in half as well. So if I do slow motion with, let's say, I push this up to 120 frames, it will be cut by half. So I don't have to manually type in a value. Let's switch to slow motion again. I will make 100 frames per second, as you see on the top right. It's 100. Again? Sorry. I need a remote for that, I think. 120 of a second divided by half is 1/240th of a second, right? 120 frames, 241 by 240, my God. So you don't have to type the value. If you go back to 25p, it's automatically on the, that's right? Yeah. It's automatically switching back. That's the advantage he wanted to show, because you don't have to think about shutter times. It's always the half of the frame rate. If you go to 400 frames per second, if possible, its shutter speed is 1/800th of a second. So it's always going with you. That's an advantage because you don't have to type it. You're just going forth and back. The drawback is you have to think in degree values. If somebody says, I want a shorter shutter time for sport, for example, then you have to say 180th of a second, how much is it when I calculate? This is something mostly film people do, and film high schools also teach it, because that's inherited by the film cameras. And shutter times is inherited, let's say, from the broadcast cameras and, of course, out of photography.
What is the 0 point of this degrees? I mean, 0 stands for...
This is exactly, it's just a 1/10 of a degree. So you can have different shutter times, like, let's say...
So 360 is the complete frame rate.
Yeah, that's a good point. 360 is complete frame rate, and you can make the shutter bigger or smaller. You can see, you can even go way up beyond the frame rate. That's a long-term exposure. So if you shoot 25p, every frame has 1 of a 25-second time for exposure, but I can also expose 32 frames added on and combined into one frame. Of course, the motion, as you see, is not working anymore, because this is more than 1 second of a second exposure. So it's a long time exposure. And if you go beyond it into one frame is 360 degrees, because the next step would be 2 frames. And if you divide it a little bit more, you can go to 300, 270, etc., etc., etc. And there are some .8, you know, some tenth of degrees steps as well. And of course there's a list, or you can calculate what time this is. Actually, if 360 degrees is 1 second, you can, is it right, 1 second? 1 frame, sorry. You can also calculate what is the shutter speed. To be honest, most people I know are more familiar with the time, like 1/50th of a second, 100th of a second. And more filmic people, or coming from RED, etc., a little bit more orientated in the shutter degree. But shutter degree has the advantage, when you change the frame rate, the shutter goes with it. Yeah, and if you have the shutter time, it's independent of the frame rate of the camera. So perhaps we can put it this way. Okay, plop.
The automatic ND is actually quite nice.
Yeah, if you do the right setup for this, the automatic ND can compensate for that. Yeah, and or you make push ND, and the camera gives you the right exposure again. I think FX9, FX6. Yeah.
In the new firmware, they did something about the focus breathing with the autofocus. Is that an option you have to set on the setting?
I must admit that I don't have experience with that, to be honest. The idea always was, there was already a setting in all the cameras with compensation of distortion. So if you take a, let's say, cheap lens, I don't have a cheap lens here. If you have a very cheap lens that has barrel distortion, for example, the lens is known by the camera, and the camera says, okay, I will re-distort it, so that you have a better looking thing. If you use zoom lenses, the problem sometimes can be focus breathing, and all these lenses like this one do it anyway. They do an electronic compensation of focus breathing and distortion. We don't know it because nobody talks about it, because this kind of lenses are fixed installed on the smaller handheld cameras. And Sony always did it that if you're zooming in, the focus will be pushed. Sometimes, or vice versa, if you focus, the zoom tries to put it a little bit so that you don't have focus breathing. And as far as I know, they try to do it with photo lenses now as well. I'm not sure how well this works, and if it works with any lenses, because not all the lenses are recognized by the camera. So actually, this is sometimes a question of trying. And sometimes it's a good thing, and sometimes it's a bad thing. For example, on the FS7, I found one of the very cheap zoom lenses. It's the 18-105 f4. It's a very cheap lens, very lightweight lens. It's a small barrel, and as long as you shot HD in the FS7, it could compensate the distortion of the lens. Even if you zoomed in and you had, let's say, a pillow distortion, and if you zoom out, you have a different distortion. It was compensated. But it was not compensated in 4K because there was no pixel to compensate for. You couldn't take the outer parts because there were no pixels. And I was absolutely surprised how bad the lens was when we switched it to 4K. And I said, oh my God, is this the same lens? Or let's switch back to HD again. So actually, I must admit, I have to check for some zoom lenses, or you have to check yourself. Yeah. Yeah.
And my last question,
yeah.
Within the FS7, you had the monitor LUT
yeah.
you could use, and if you used it on the viewfinder, then it would burn into the file.
This is the difference between today on the FX6 between shooting custom mode, and you can load lookup tables that you burn in. And if you go S-Log, it's not burned in. It's only for viewfinder and SDI out in general, because then you see the lookup table in the viewfinder, but you record the S-Log. So for those people who want to burn it in, you can do it in custom mode, and you can do white balances, you can do color compensations, and you can load in your favorite film lookup table and burn it in, but this is on purpose. And the other workflow is we don't burn in the lookup table, it's just for viewing only. So that's
also burning on the other workflow.
I must...
you can choose if you want it.
Yeah, there are parameters like in the FX9. I know it especially have you seen it? because on the FX9, the FX9 is really limited in this regard. The FX9 is a 4K camera, in general, taking the picture out of a 6K sensor. And this is put into hardware. So the 6K recording is compensated in 4K, and this doesn't take any additional processing power. But if you want to take the 4K picture and make an HD recording out of it, a software processing comes into play and makes 4K to HD. And unfortunately, this software processing takes away the possibility of dividing lookup tables into viewfinder and internal recording. That means as long as you shoot 4K in the FX9, as long as you shoot 4K in the FX9, you're quite flexible, not as flexible as in the FS7, but quite flexible. But as soon as you switch to HD recording, lookup table in the viewfinder means you record lookup table also in the recording. It's a really, really big drawback against FS7. And Sony, well, they're on version 3 now, and they tried to push the processing into this, but they didn't work. It didn't work yet, so they didn't manage it. So probably my suspicion is they took the FS7 and made it an FX9, and they took the very basics, let's say, out of the FS7, and they pushed the processing or put some more processing power in it or whatever, but it was not enough to have all these divisions. And the FX6 is development from scratch and don't have 6K. Some people forget that 6K against 4K is nearly double the pixel. Some people say, oh, 6K, 4K, it's not the big deal. It's only 2K difference. No, it's square. Because it's the area getting wider. So you have 6,000 by 4,000 pixels, roughly. That means that's nearly double the pixel of 4K, and the camera, the FX9, has to calculate double the pixels, roughly, against an FS7 or against an FX6. And perhaps this is the point where the FX6, newer processing, lookup tables, white balance, is more advanced than the FX9. But the FX9 makes 6K sensor, and that's the advantage of the FX9 again.
Yeah. The process is 6K to 4K and 4K to HD. So it has a 2 times.
It's a serial. Yeah, it's a serial.
It doesn't have enough power to do that.
Yeah.
I asked the guy from Sony, and they said, well, we could have taken out autofocus, but what would you rather want? So
yeah.
LUTs or autofocus?
Okay, let's combine it. Take out ND filter for image stabilization. Let's take out focus, autofocus for lookup tables. Okay, it's getting less and less. Okay, I think I would like to to talk about FX9, FX6 with a smaller group, because we'll leave to Rotterdam for the graphic high school. Thank you very much. If you are interested, write down this email address. Give me email address. Just give me a small. Shit, this one. Just drop me a small line if you have more questions, or if you need something else, or if you are working in a facility that could need a hands-on camera training. I'm always coming. I like coming here, so that's a favorite thing. Yeah, thank you very much. It was very communicative, at least for me. And yeah, if some question, just give me an email. Thank you very much, and thank you. Hey! Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Can you do an applause for Vocas as well, because they made the nice setup. Okay. Yes.